He found them in a broken-down house at the end of a dirt road. 2 little boys. His boys. The same jaw, the same storm-gray eyes, the same blood, his blood, living in a house so small it could fit inside his office elevator, wearing shoes held together with faith and friction, sharing a single mattress in a room with a ceiling that wept every time it rained. His twin sons. Hidden. For 2 years and 4 months. By the woman downstairs in his penthouse, right now, wearing his ring, planning their wedding, signing documents that would make her the sole beneficiary of a $4.7 billion empire the moment they said "I do." She knew about these boys from the moment they were conceived. She knew who their mother was. She knew what they were worth, what they threatened. And she buried them anyway. Buried a pregnant woman's career with fabricated evidence. Intercepted every phone call, every email, every desperate attempt that mother made to reach the man who deserved to know the truth. She paid people to make sure these 2 children spent their first years of life in poverty, deliberately, calculatingly, cold-bloodedly, so that she could spend those same years inheriting everything that was rightfully theirs. 3 weeks before the wedding. That's how close she got. 3 weeks. So tell me something. When a billionaire walks through that broken door and looks into the eyes of the sons who were stolen from him, what happens to the woman who stole them? What happens to the empire she almost owned? And what happens to the maid, the one everybody called just the help, when the truth she's been protecting alone, in silence, in poverty, for 2 years and 4 months, finally detonates? The elevator doors opened on the 47th floor of Blackwell Tower, and Chicago surrendered beneath the glass like a kingdom that had long ago accepted its defeat. On clear mornings, and this October morning was ruthlessly clear, you could see the full arc of Lake Michigan from the northeast corner window, a great silver curve that looked, from this height, less like water and more like the outer edge of the known world. The kind of view that made first-time visitors stop walking and simply stand, struck silent by the scale of it. The kind of view that artists painted and tourists photographed and poets attempted, inadequately, to describe. Nathan Blackwell had not looked at it in 3 years. He sat behind a desk that was 8 feet of solid black walnut, imported, custom-built, and completely buried under the organized architecture of a man who had not stopped working since the previous morning. Spreadsheets, legal briefs, merger documents flagged in 4 colors, 2 phones, 1 personal, 1 corporate, both face down, both buzzing with the quiet persistence of things that needed him and had learned to wait their turn. He was 34, and he was the kind of man that made other powerful men recalibrate their posture when he entered a room. Not because he was loud, Nathan Blackwell was almost never loud, but because he carried the specific gravitational weight of someone who has been tested by real consequences and has not broken, and other people's bodies register that quality before their minds catch up. His shoulders were broad beneath a charcoal suit that had been fitted by a tailor on Michigan Avenue who charged $4,000 per garment, and considered that reasonable. His jaw was set in its permanent configuration, strong, symmetrical, slightly forward, the jaw of a man who has been clenching against something for so long he no longer notices he's doing it. And his eyes, those storm-gray eyes that his board members described, privately, as the most unsettling feature of any negotiation, moved across the spreadsheet on his desk with the unhurried, absolute focus of a surgeon who has already decided what needs to be cut. Blackwell Global had opened that morning at $4.7 billion. The number was the result of 4 years of relentless reconstruction. 4 years ago, his father, Elias Blackwell, the man who had built this company from a single industrial supply warehouse in 1987, who had turned one good idea and 30 years of stubborn work into a diversified global firm, had suffered a stroke so severe and so sudden that the board was convening emergency sessions before the ambulance had reached the hospital. Elias couldn't speak. couldn't walk, couldn't protect what he'd built. And what he'd built was bleeding. 3 major clients had opened quiet conversations with competitors. A senior vice president named Roland Graves had begun positioning himself with enough board members to potentially force a leadership transition. 2 division heads had already updated their LinkedIn profiles, the corporate equivalent of rats locating the exits. Nathan had been in London, closing a logistics acquisition, when his father's assistant called him. He had boarded the next flight home, and somewhere over the Atlantic, in the particular clarity that comes from 30,000 feet and genuine emergency, he had made a decision. He would not let his father's life's work collapse. He had returned to Chicago and dismantled Roland Graves's quiet coup in 11 days. He had personally called each of the wavering clients, not to reassure them, but to present them with a precise, documented analysis of why their alternatives were inferior and what it would cost them, specifically, to walk away from Blackwell Global. He had stabilized the board by the end of the first month through a combination of demonstrated competence and the kind of controlled, surgical pressure that left people feeling they had made their own choices. He had done all of this without ever once performing grief, or asking for patience, or explaining that his father was lying in a hospital bed, unable to recognize him on some mornings. The cost of this had been everything else. His friendships, the few he'd maintained from college, from his early career, had quietly dissolved under the weight of unavailability. His apartment, a $12,000 a month penthouse in the Gold Coast, was maintained by a service that came twice a week to clean and stock the refrigerator with food he largely didn't eat. He had not taken a single day off in 3 years. He slept less than 6 hours on most nights and had stopped noticing the deficit. He had become, in the precise language of the profile that Forbes had published 8 months ago, the most effective and least knowable CEO in the Midwest. What Forbes had not published because they hadn't known was that 6 months ago, Cassandra Holt had walked into his life through a door that had been very carefully, very deliberately, left open for her. She arrived now without knocking. She never knocked, and Nathan had never corrected this, which was itself a small surrender he hadn't noticed making, and moved through his office the way she moved through every space she occupied, with the complete physical ease of someone who has predecided that she belongs there. She was 32, auburn hair that was never out of place, maintained with the consistency of infrastructure rather than vanity. Features that were genuinely striking, high cheekbones, green eyes, a mouth that smiled with remarkable technical precision. She was dressed in a deep burgundy blazer and tailored black trousers, and the diamond engagement ring on her left hand, 3 carats, emerald cut, platinum band, from a jeweler she had guided Nathan toward without his quite registering the guidance, caught the morning light as she set a folder on his desk and scattered cold sparks across the ceiling. "Meridian closes Friday," she said, settling into the chair across from him as though it were her own. "I spoke with 2 of their board members yesterday. They're nervous about the personnel restructuring clause. I've suggested a 12-month transition guarantee." Nathan set down his pen. "You spoke to their board." His voice dropped into its quiet register, the one that his executive team had learned to treat as a weather warning. "Without legal present, without my authorization. In 3 weeks I'll be your wife." The smile arrived exactly on cue, warm and immovable. "Your interests are my interests. I was protecting the deal." The gray eyes held her for a beat that stretched past comfortable. "Don't do it again," he said, and returned to the spreadsheet. She took this, the absence of a longer argument, the return to work, as a small victory. She always found the concession inside the non-confrontation. It was one of the things she was best at. She turned to look out the window at the city below, and her expression, in the half-second before she composed it into something else, was not the expression of a woman looking at a skyline. It was the expression of a woman looking at an inventory. What Nathan could not see, what he had never been positioned to see, was that the folder she'd just placed on his desk contained a subtle, almost imperceptible error in one of the meridian projections. An error that would, if uncorrected, expose a contractual vulnerability. An error that Cassandra had introduced deliberately, 3 days ago, in a version of the document she knew would be the one used today. Not to sabotage the deal, to be the one who caught it. She would mention it casually at the right moment in front of the right people. She would say, "Actually, Nathan, I noticed something in the projections," and she would be right, and she would be seen to be right, and the board members present would register once again that Cassandra Holt was indispensable. This was how she operated, not in large, obvious power grabs, but in hundreds of tiny, invisible maneuvers, each one individually unremarkable, collectively constructing a position so embedded and so necessary that removing her would feel like surgery on something vital. She had been doing this for 6 months. She had been planning it for 14 months before that. And there was one thing, one specific non-negotiable thing, that the entire plan required: the permanent, irrevocable disappearance of a woman named Clara Reyes, who was, at this moment, 300 miles away in a small Indiana town, making pancakes for 2 little boys with storm-gray eyes. Completely unaware that the man who had given those boys their eyes was sitting in a tower above a city he owned, about to have his entire world taken apart by a truth that had been waiting, patient and inevitable, for 2 years and 4 months. 3 years earlier, the 47th floor of Blackwell Tower had looked different. Not architecturally, the marble floors and the 14-foot ceilings and the floor-to-ceiling glass were the same, but the atmosphere had been different in the way that a house is different when someone is still living in it. There had been more people then, more movement in the hallways, more voices behind closed doors. Elias Blackwell, even after his first minor cardiac event 2 years before his stroke, had maintained the habit of walking the floor on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, stopping to talk to people, asking questions that were not strategic but simply human. The staff had liked him. The building had felt, in some hard-to-define way, inhabited. Nathan had been running the company's international division then, not yet CEO, but clearly being positioned for it by a father who had more wisdom than he was often given credit for. He worked the same hours he worked now, applied the same precision, produced the same results. But there had still been, 3 years ago, a version of Nathan Blackwell that occasionally ate dinner at an actual table, that occasionally called his college friend Derek Walsh on a Friday night just to talk, that occasionally stood at the corner window and looked at the lake with something that resembled peace. That version of Nathan Blackwell had met Clara Reyes on a Tuesday evening in October, 3 years ago, almost to the day, and the meeting had been so small, so unremarkable in its surface details, that neither of them had understood what it was at the time. It was 11 o'clock at night. The floor was nearly empty. A skeleton crew of 1 security guard on the elevator bank and 2 junior analysts burning midnight oil in the conference room at the far end of the hall. Nathan had been returning from the kitchen with a glass of water he was going to forget to drink when he turned the corner and found a woman standing completely still in the middle of the hallway, reading a document. She was part of the contracted cleaning crew. She wore the pale gray uniform that the building's facilities company required, and she had a cart beside her stocked with cleaning supplies, and she was standing under one of the hallway's recessed lights, holding a document she had apparently retrieved from the recycling pile beside the paper shredder, reading it with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had found something unexpectedly interesting. She was annotating it. With a pen she'd pulled from the front pocket of her uniform, she was making small, precise notes in the margins of what Nathan, drawing closer, recognized as a confidential internal legal brief. "That's a restricted document," he said. She did not startle. She looked up at him with dark brown eyes that were completely composed, not the composure of someone caught doing something wrong and covering it, but the composure of someone who has been underestimated so many times that surprise has lost its power over her. "I know," she said. "It was in the recycling pile. Someone misfiled it. I was going to return it to the document room." She paused. "But there's a clause on page 14 that would expose the company to liability in 3 states. I wanted to make sure I was reading it correctly before I flagged it." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. "You were going to flag it," he said. "To someone," she said simply. "I didn't know who. I still don't know who you are." This was either the most genuine thing anyone had said to him in months, or the most sophisticated opening gambit he had ever encountered, and he found, somewhat to his own irritation, that he couldn't immediately determine which. "Nathan Blackwell," he said. Something moved across her face, a recalibration, a brief reassessment, and then settled back into that steady composure. "Then you're exactly who I should give this to," she said, and handed him the brief. Her name was Clara Reyes. She was 26 years old. She had grown up in Pilsen, on Chicago's Lower West Side, the eldest daughter of a Mexican-American family that had always had more dignity than money, a distinction her mother had maintained carefully and her father had embodied effortlessly. Her father, Rodrigo Reyes, had worked 30 years as a machinist and had read to Clara every night until she was old enough to read to him. He had died of pancreatic cancer when Clara was 19, 11 months after diagnosis, which was the specific cruelty of that disease. Enough time to watch it happen, not enough time to make peace with it. Clara had been 3 semesters into a pre-law program at the University of Illinois Chicago when the medical bills from her father's illness, combined with the loss of his income, made the math of continuing impossible. She had tried every avenue, scholarships, grants, work-study arrangements, and had come close enough to making it work that the failure had a particular, precise quality of devastation. She had left school in the spring semester of her second year, carrying a 3.9 GPA and a functional understanding of contract law that she had nowhere to apply. She had spent the following 4 years doing whatever work she could find that paid reliably: administrative assistant, retail, food service. She had landed with the building services contractor 18 months ago because the pay was better than it looked on paper. The hours were flexible, and she was, among other things, extraordinarily good at being in places without disturbing them. She was also extraordinarily good at noticing things. She had noticed, in her 18 months on the 47th floor, that the senior VP who everyone deferred to was systematically taking credit for his junior analyst's work. She had noticed that the document room had a filing error that was creating compliance issues nobody had caught. She had noticed that the building's east stairwell had a fire door that didn't fully close, which was a code violation. She had mentioned none of these things, because there was no appropriate channel for a cleaning crew member to report observations about corporate operations, and she had understood, without bitterness, that the structure of this world was not built to receive information from people in her position. Until Nathan Blackwell had turned a corner and found her reading a legal brief at 11 o'clock at night. That conversation in the hallway had lasted 14 minutes. Nathan had read page 14. He had looked at her notes in the margins, 3 annotations, each one precise, each one legally sound. He had asked her 2 questions about her background, and she had answered them directly, without elaboration, without any of the self-diminishment that he'd observed in people who felt they needed to justify taking up space in his presence. He had not made any decision that night. He had taken the document, thanked her in a tone that conveyed he understood its inadequacy, and gone back to his office. The following Monday, he had called the head of his household management service and asked them to reach out to a member of the building cleaning crew about a different position. He had not explained his reasoning to anyone, because his reasoning was not entirely explicable. It was something closer to instinct, the same instinct that made him a good negotiator, the ability to recognize value in places where other people had stopped looking. Clara had become his residence manager, the person responsible for running his penthouse, coordinating his household staff, managing the logistics of his personal life so that his professional life could operate without interruption. He had increased her salary to $78,000 a year, which was 3 times what she had been earning, and had said nothing about it beyond the offer. She had said, "I accept," and had not made it into anything more than what it was. For 18 months they had maintained a relationship that was professional, respectful, and rigorously appropriate, employer and employee, their interactions efficient and their boundaries clear. She anticipated his needs without being sycophantic about it. She flagged problems before they became emergencies. She managed his household staff, a rotating team of 4 people, with a quiet authority that none of them questioned. She never overstepped. She never angled for more than her role. She never made him feel observed, even though he had a persistent, low-level awareness that she noticed things about him that other people missed. Once, very early in her role, she had left a glass of water on the edge of his home desk during a late work session, not a big gesture, just placed it there and walked away without comment. And he had drunk it without thinking and only realized later that he'd had a headache all afternoon from dehydration and hadn't consciously registered it. He hadn't mentioned this to her. She hadn't mentioned it either. But after that, there was always water on his desk during late sessions. It was the smallest possible thing. It was also the first time in longer than he could remember that another person had noticed something he needed before he'd asked for it. There was one night, one specific, clarifying, devastating night, when the line between employer and employee had blurred. It was during the worst stretch of the Blackwell global crisis, 14 months into Nathan's tenure as CEO, when 2 board members had mounted a coordinated challenge to his authority, and a client worth $200 million in annual revenue had formally announced they were moving to a competitor. He had come home at 2 in the morning to find Clara still at his apartment. She had stayed late to handle a facilities emergency and had been waiting to brief him on it. He had poured scotch he shouldn't have opened. They had talked, first about the logistics issue she'd stayed to handle, then because the scotch was good and the hour was late and the city below the windows looked different at 2 in the morning, smaller, somehow, more survivable about other things. She had told him about her father, about leaving law school, about the specific feeling of knowing what you are capable of and being unable to find a structure that will allow you to prove it. He had listened in the way he never listened in meetings, without the part of his brain that was already formulating responses running simultaneously. He had just listened. And he had told her something he had not told anyone. Not his attorney, not Derek, not the therapist he had seen twice and then stopped seeing because he didn't have time. He had told her that he was afraid his father would die without ever knowing whether the company survived, and that some nights he thought the cruelest thing about the whole situation was not the work or the pressure, but the fact that the one person he would have called to talk through all of it was the one person he couldn't call anymore. She had not offered him reassurance. She had not told him it would be fine. She had simply said, "I know," in a tone that made it clear she actually did, that she had sat with that specific species of grief herself and understood its texture. One night, one conversation, one moment at the window where the city was small and the scotch was finished, and something true and irreversible had passed between 2 people who had been very carefully not acknowledging that they were, in some important way, paying attention to each other. It had not happened again. Because 3 weeks later, Cassandra Holt had arrived, and everything that might have grown from that single night had been, with surgical precision, destroyed. What Nathan could not know, what he would not know for 3 more years, was that Clara had left his apartment that night carrying the early biological evidence of that one irreversible evening, without yet knowing it herself. And that by the time she did know, Cassandra had already begun building the architecture of her destruction. In the hallway outside Nathan's office, the night they met, Clara had handed him a legal brief and changed the direction of both their lives. She had just not known then what direction that would be. Cassandra Holt had researched Nathan Blackwell for 14 months before she ever shook his hand. This was not unusual for her. Cassandra approached significant targets, and Nathan Blackwell was, by any measure, the most significant target she had ever selected. The way a cartographer approaches unmapped territory, methodically, comprehensively, and with the understanding that thorough preparation was the difference between a successful expedition and a catastrophic one. She had a file on him, not a metaphorical file, an actual one, maintained on an encrypted laptop that she kept in a fireproof safe in her apartment. 47 pages, organized by category, professional history, personality analysis derived from public statements and interviews, known associates, documented vulnerabilities, established preferences, and, most importantly, a section titled Points of Entry that identified the specific circumstances under which Nathan Blackwell could be most effectively approached. His documented vulnerabilities were few and specific. He was isolated by design and by circumstance. The combination of his personality and his workload had reduced his social ecosystem to a handful of people, none of whom occupied the role of genuine intimate. He was loyal to a fault once loyalty was established. His entire 4-year reconstruction of Blackwell Global was evidence of that, a monument to his willingness to sacrifice everything for something he believed in. And he was buried under layers of control and competence and deliberate inaccessibility, profoundly alone. The kind of alone that comes from years of prioritizing the imperative over the personal until the personal has atrophied past easy recovery. These were not weaknesses Cassandra pitied. They were entry points she cataloged. She had not always operated this way. There had been a version of Cassandra Holt, younger, still forming, still carrying the particular hunger of someone who grew up watching other people's wealth from the outside, who had simply been ambitious without being predatory. The daughter of a mid-level insurance adjuster in suburban Ohio, she had been the smartest person in every room she occupied from the age of 8, and she had understood early that intelligence alone, without the right connections and the right positioning, would take her only so far. She had gone to Wharton on a partial scholarship and 2 side jobs. She had graduated in the top 7% of her class. She had taken a position at a consulting firm in New York and demonstrated, within 18 months, a capability for strategic thinking that warranted genuine admiration. And then she had encountered Diane Mercer. Diane Mercer was a senior partner, 52, unmarried, brilliant, and in possession of a corner office, and a salary that Cassandra at 24 had identified as the target she was working toward. For 3 years, Cassandra had attached herself to Diane's projects, learned everything Diane knew, made herself invaluable in ways both obvious and invisible. Then Diane had received a promotion that took her out of the division entirely, and the credit for every major project they had worked on together, credit that Diane had promised would be attributed appropriately, had been consolidated, quietly, entirely under Diane's name. Cassandra had received a generous performance review and a 4% raise. She had sat with that for a week. She had done the accounting, the hours, the ideas, the relationships she had built, the results she had produced, and she had reached a conclusion that reorganized everything that came after it. Being good enough was not sufficient. Being indispensable was not sufficient. The only position that was truly secure was the position at the top, and the only way to reach the top was to be willing to do what people who were merely talented were not willing to do. She had left the firm within the month. She had spent the following 2 years building a consulting practice that gave her access to the financial and personal lives of a dozen mid-level executives, learning their operations from the inside while constructing the network and the reputation she needed for the next phase. And then she had found Nathan Blackwell, or rather, she had found the opportunity that Nathan Blackwell represented. A recently dominant CEO, newly isolated, without a genuine personal infrastructure, sitting at the center of a $4.7 billion empire that was, structurally, waiting for the right person to make herself essential to it. She had engineered her introduction through director Gerald Fitch, a 60-year-old board member with old money connections, a taste for luxury he could barely sustain on his director's salary, and a history of being generous with introductions when the right incentive was applied. Cassandra had identified Fitch's financial vulnerabilities 3 months before she approached him, and she had approached him not with an overt proposition, but with an investment opportunity. A carefully structured deal that was legitimate enough to be undeniable and profitable enough to create obligation. Fitch had introduced her to Nathan at a board dinner 6 months ago, framing her as a strategic consultant worth knowing. She had arrived at that dinner having already decided exactly who she would be in Nathan's presence. Not impressed, not deferential, not angling, simply equal. A peer. Someone who matched his intelligence without performing it, who challenged his assumptions without undermining him, who made him feel, for perhaps the first time in a long time, that he was in the company of someone operating at his level. It had worked with devastating efficiency. Within 8 weeks, she was consulting on 2 Blackwell projects. Within 12 weeks, she had made herself a fixture on the 47th floor. Within 4 months, she had identified the precise moment, a difficult board meeting, a hard week, a Friday evening when Nathan had stayed late and was moving through his apartment with the isolated, mechanical quality of a man who has forgotten what it feels like to simply be somewhere, to shift the register from professional to personal. Within 6 months, the ring. But there was a problem. There had always been a problem. Lurking in the background of her plan like a structural fault, she had identified and noted and decided to manage. Clara Reyes. Cassandra had noticed her in the first week. Not because Clara did anything to draw attention. Clara was extraordinarily good at not drawing attention, but because Cassandra was extraordinarily good at noticing the things that other people were pretending not to notice. And what she had noticed in those first weeks on the 47th floor was that Nathan Blackwell's posture changed by a measurable degree when Clara Reyes entered his peripheral vision. Nothing dramatic, nothing that anyone else would have registered. Just a slight adjustment, a loosening almost, a reduction in the tension he carried in his shoulders that happened automatically and apparently without his awareness. And she had noticed that Clara, for her part, never looked at Nathan directly in company, but always seemed to know where he was in a room with a precision that suggested some other sense was operating. Cassandra had stood in Nathan's kitchen one evening, watching him cross the apartment to answer a question Clara had asked from the hallway, and she had felt something that she would have described as data rather than emotion. A cold, clear recognition that this specific variable needed to be eliminated from the equation. She had begun building the architecture of Clara's destruction the following week, not impulsively, methodically. She needed evidence that would be compelling enough to trigger Nathan's professional values over his personal instincts. She needed it to be clean enough to withstand a brief examination, and she needed it to be permanent enough that Clara would have no viable path back. She had called Marcus Webb on a Thursday afternoon. Marcus was 44, compact, unremarkable in appearance, and had built a successful career in the space between what people needed done and what they were willing to do themselves. He had a record 2 dropped charges, 1 conviction for evidence falsification that had been plea bargained down, and an absolute rule against working for anyone who couldn't pay his rate without flinching. Cassandra had been referred to him by a former client who described him as thorough. "I need a situation managed," she had said. "An employee. She needs to be removed, permanently, legally, and without anything tracing back to me." "What kind of employee?" Marcus had asked. Household staff, Cassandra had said. The kind that nobody notices until they're already gone. She had said it with perfect calm, the way she said everything. What she did not know, what she could not have known, because it had not yet happened, was that the woman she was preparing to destroy was already carrying a secret that would, 3 years later, bring everything Cassandra had built crashing down around her. The universe was already arranging what Cassandra could not yet see. She was meticulous, and she was ruthless, and she was almost certainly the most dangerous person in any room she occupied. Almost. Marcus Webb did not cut corners. This was, paradoxically, the thing that made him valuable to people like Cassandra Holt, not an absence of ethics, which was common enough, but the presence of a genuine professional standard applied to unethical ends. He planned. He documented his planning so he could identify weaknesses before they became exposures. He built every operation with 3 layers: the visible action, the backstop that protected the visible action, and the exit that protected him if both of the preceding layers failed. The Clara Reyes operation, as he came to think of it, took 6 weeks to construct properly. The first 2 weeks were observation. Marcus's associate, a woman named Tina Garfield, who was unremarkable in appearance and very good at being in public spaces without anyone remembering she'd been there, had spent those 2 weeks in Clara Reyes' proximity. She rode the same elevator. She sat 2 tables away in the building's ground-floor cafe. She noted Clara's schedule, her habits, the people she interacted with, the security checkpoints she passed through and when. What Tina reported back to Marcus was not particularly useful for building a case against Clara. She was, by every observable measure, exactly what she appeared to be: punctual, professional, private, unremarkable. She did not take things home in her bag that didn't belong there. She did not linger in rooms she had no business lingering in. She did not have the loose, careless quality that made fabrications easy. Marcus had said to Cassandra at the end of week 2, "She's clean. This is going to require more architecture." Cassandra had said, "I don't care what it requires." So Marcus had built the architecture. He had obtained, through a contact at the building's facilities management company, the access codes for the building's secondary security camera system, not the main corporate system, which was managed by Blackwell's own security team and therefore too heavily monitored, but the facilities system, which covered service corridors and storage areas and was managed by a third-party contractor with less rigorous oversight. He had used those codes to access 3 specific camera feeds and edit 6 minutes of footage across 2 separate days. The edits were precise. They placed Clara, or a figure in her uniform of approximately her height and build, in a storage room on the 44th floor, a room that housed, among other things, a collection of decorative items that included a pearl and sapphire brooch that had belonged to Nathan's late mother, and that Nathan kept in the building for reasons more sentimental than practical. The brooch would subsequently disappear from the storage room, because Marcus would take it. He had also, and this was the layer that made Cassandra almost admire the work, arranged for 2 small discrepancies to appear in the building's cleaning supply inventory. Items checked out under the digital access code assigned to Clara's crew. Items that individually were too small to notice. Collectively, a pattern. The visible action, a missing brooch, security footage, inventory discrepancies. The backstop, a building security officer named Dennis Rule who owed Marcus a favor that predated his employment at Blackwell Tower and who had agreed, for additional compensation, to ensure the footage and the inventory report were routed to the right desk at the right time. The exit, Marcus himself had never set foot on the relevant floors. Tina had. The facility's contact had. Dennis Rule had. Marcus was 3 layers removed from everything physical. It was clean. It was, by the standards of what it was, elegant. Cassandra had received the assembled package on a Thursday morning. A folder containing the edited security report, the inventory discrepancy analysis, and a cover memo from Dennis Rule nodding that he had flagged the matter internally, but wanted to bring it to someone's personal attention given the nature of the missing item. She had held the folder for a moment. She had felt briefly something that a more self-aware person might have identified as the last checkpoint before a line, the last moment at which a different decision was still available. She had set the feeling aside the way she set aside all feelings that were not operationally useful. She had walked to Nathan's office. "I need to talk to you about something," she had said, sitting across from his desk and arranging her face into the precise expression of someone delivering painful information reluctantly. Brow slightly furrowed, eye contact direct but soft, voice careful. "I didn't want to bring this to you. I know how much you trust her." She had set the folder on his desk. Nathan had read it in silence. The gray eyes had moved across the pages with the same methodical focus he brought to everything, no visible reaction, no immediate judgment. He had asked 2 questions, one about the chain of custody for the footage, one about when the inventory discrepancy had first been identified. Cassandra had answered both. Marcus had prepared her for both. Then Nathan had sat for a long time without speaking. And Cassandra had watched him, and she had thought, he doesn't want this to be true. She had seen it in the slight tension around his jaw, the way his eyes had returned to one specific page rather than moving through the document sequentially. He was looking for the thing that would make it not true. He hadn't found it, because Marcus hadn't left anything to find. "I'll need to speak with her," Nathan had said finally. "Of course," Cassandra had said, standing, smoothing her jacket. "I'm sorry, Nathan, I really am." She had been walking out of the office when he'd said, very quietly, "Thank you for bringing this to me." She had paused at the door. "I would always bring you the truth," she had said. The irony of this sentence, the specific, breathtaking audacity of it, she would not fully appreciate for another 3 years. She would not appreciate it until she was standing in a ballroom of 300 people, watching the truth arrive in a form she had not predicted, wearing 2 small faces with storm-gray eyes. But that was 3 years away. For now, she walked away from Nathan's office with a perfectly composed expression, took the elevator to the lobby, sat in the back of her car, and called Marcus Webb. "It's done," she said. "And the next part?" Marcus asked, because Marcus always understood that termination was rarely the end of the work. "Monitor her," Cassandra said. "I want to know where she goes. I want to know who she contacts. I want to know if she tries to reach him." She paused. "And if she does, I want to know about it before he does." "That's ongoing," Marcus said. "That costs more." "I know what it costs," Cassandra said. "Invoice the usual account." She ended the call and looked out the window of her car as the driver pulled into traffic. She had not factored in the possibility that Clara Reyes was already, at that moment, making her own preparations, that the woman she was treating as a problem to be managed had, in fact, noticed the email, had photographed it, had sent the photograph to an encrypted cloud account using a phone she paid for in cash. She had not factored in that Clara Reyes had spent 2 years in law school and had understood, from the day she found that email, that the truth required protection before it could become useful. Cassandra was meticulous. Clara was patient. These were not the same thing, and patience in the end is the more dangerous quality. The conversation that ended Clara Reyes' employment at Blackwell Global lasted 9 minutes. She knew this because she counted, not in the moment, but afterward, sitting in the lobby of a Walgreens 4 blocks from the tower, in the particular suspended state that arrives after something devastating and before the body has caught up with the mind's understanding of what has just happened. She sat with her coat in her lap and her bag at her feet and counted the minutes backward with the precision of someone inventorying a loss. 9 minutes. Nathan had called her into his office at 4 p.m. on a Thursday. She had come in from the kitchen where she had been reviewing the household schedule for the following week, and she had known, before he said a word, before she saw the expression on his face, that something was catastrophically wrong. Not because he looked angry. Nathan Blackwell angry was a known quantity, a documented weather pattern with identifiable characteristics. This was something else. He looked like a man who has made a decision he doesn't want to have made, and has decided that the only way through it is to not stop moving. He didn't offer her a seat. He didn't do preamble. He opened a folder on his desk and turned it to face her. "I want to give you the opportunity to explain this before I do anything with it," he said. She had looked at the documents, the security report, the inventory analysis, the footage description. She would not actually see the footage. She would only be told what it allegedly showed. Her name attached to things she had not done, in places she had not been, taking things she had never touched. She had felt the floor shift. Not in panic. In a different way, the particular vertigo of someone who has encountered something impossible and is working to establish whether reality has failed or their understanding of it has. "This isn't accurate," she said. "The security system." "I know what the security system allegedly shows." She kept her voice level because something in her understood with crystalline clarity that this was a moment where losing composure would cost her more than she could afford. "I am telling you that it isn't accurate. I was not in that room. I have never been in that room. I did not take anything." Nathan had looked at her. Those storm gray eyes, the eyes that had looked at her across his kitchen at 2 in the morning, the eyes that had listened to her talk about her father with an attention that felt like something being handed carefully between people, were not cold. They were worse than cold. They were resolved. He had already decided. "The brooch belonged to my mother," he said. The specific quiet of that sentence, not an accusation, not a challenge, just a fact delivered in a voice that had gone very small, was the most devastating thing in the room. Clara stood with her hands at her sides and she looked at him, and she said the most important thing she had ever said to Nathan Blackwell, the thing she would replay in the years that followed, the thing she had been right about, and the thing that had not mattered at all. "I know what the evidence says. I'm asking you what you believe." The silence that followed was 11 seconds long. She counted those two. Nathan said nothing. And the silence said everything. It said, "I believe the folder. I believe the footage. I believe the woman who brought this to me, who is going to be my wife, who I have decided to trust." The silence said, "I am not going to choose your word over this evidence, even though something in me doesn't want this to be true." The silence said, in the particular language of men who have walled themselves off from their own instincts, "I cannot afford to be wrong about this, so I am choosing the version of the story that comes with documentation." "There'll be a severance package," Nathan said, 2 months. She picked up her coat. She did not slam the door. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry, not then. The crying would happen later, at the kitchen table of the small apartment she shared with her younger sister Rosa, in a way that was so controlled and so brief that Rosa, coming out of her bedroom at the sound, had stood in the hallway and watched her sister sit at that table and weep for exactly 4 minutes and then stop, and had felt, watching this, something close to fear. "What happened?" Rosa had asked. "I lost my job," Clara had said. "Why?" Clara had looked at her sister, 22, still hopeful in the way that Clara was beginning to understand she herself no longer was, and had said only, "Someone decided I wasn't worth believing." She had not told Rosa about the email. She had not told anyone about the email. What she had done in the 3 weeks between finding it and being fired was think very carefully about what it meant, what she could prove, and what the appropriate next move was. The appropriate next move, she had concluded, was to document everything and wait. She did not have resources for legal action. She did not have credibility. A cleaning staff turned household employee with no physical evidence beyond a photographed email was not, in the landscape of employment law, a compelling plaintiff against a $4.7 billion corporation. But the email existed, the cloud account existed, the truth existed. And then, 2 weeks after she was fired, sitting in the bathroom of her sister's apartment on a Tuesday morning, staring at a pregnancy test with the particular quality of attention reserved for things that rearrange everything, Clara Reyes discovered that the truth was more complicated and more urgent than she had understood. She was 6 weeks pregnant. She had sat on the edge of the bathtub for a very long time. She thought about Nathan. She thought about the 9 minutes in his office and the 11 seconds of silence, and the way he had said the brooch belonged to my mother in that diminished voice. She thought about what it would mean to call him, what it would mean to be a fired employee, now pregnant, calling one of the most powerful men in Chicago with this information, in a world where Cassandra Holt was monitoring his communications. She thought about what she had and what she could prove and what she couldn't. And she made a decision. She would not stay in Chicago. The city was too small for what she needed, not geographically, but structurally. Too many of Cassandra's eyes. Too many possibilities for interception, for the kind of managed disappearance of information that she now understood Cassandra was capable of. She would go somewhere no one was looking. She would work, she would save, she would document. She would wait. She had tried to reach Nathan twice before she left, once through his personal email address, once by calling the building's main line and asking for his direct office. The first produced no response. The second produced a receptionist who said, very politely and very finally, that Mr. Blackwell was unavailable and that all communications regarding former employees should be directed to human resources. She had understood. She had packed 2 bags and her laptop and a folder of documents, the email printout, her employment records, her signed copies of every agreement, and she had driven 300 miles to a town called Millbrook, Indiana, where her college roommate had grown up and where the rent was cheap enough that she might, with 3 jobs and enough stubbornness, be able to survive. She had not told her sister where she was going, not because she didn't trust Rosa, but because she understood with the same cold clarity she'd applied to every decision in the last 3 weeks, that what Rosa didn't know, Rosa couldn't be pressured to reveal. She had driven out of Chicago at 6 in the morning, in a car with a check engine light that she was ignoring, with 2 bags and a folder and the beginning of a life she had not planned, and she had not allowed herself to look in the rearview mirror. Because looking back at that moment would have cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. What she couldn't know, sitting in that car, driving toward a house on a dirt road in Indiana, was that the thing she was carrying was not only her children. She was carrying the evidence that would, in 2 years and 4 months, detonate inside the most powerful boardroom in Chicago. She was carrying the beginning of the end. She just didn't know it yet. The town of Millbrook had 2,000 people, 1 traffic light, and the specific pride of a place that had never been important enough to be ruined. Main Street had a hardware store, a diner called Patsy's, a Dollar General that served as both grocery store and pharmacy for anyone who couldn't make the 40-minute drive to the nearest Walmart, and a barber shop run by an 80-year-old man named Earl Cutler, who had been cutting the same 20 customers' hair for 40 years and had opinions about everything and shared all of them. The elementary school had a leaking roof that the county had been promising to fix since before the current principal was hired. The one doctor's office was open 4 days a week. The nearest hospital was in Henderson, 23 miles east, a distance that Clara had memorized the first week she arrived, because she was going to have children and needed to know exactly how far away help was. She had found the house on Sycamore Road through her college roommate's mother, a woman who had mentioned, in passing, that old Mrs. Dorothy Hofstede at the end of Sycamore had a small rental she never advertised because she was particular about tenants. Clara had introduced herself to Mrs. Hofstede on a Wednesday afternoon, sat with her for an hour in a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and old wood, and answered every question the old woman asked with such direct, unhurried honesty that Mrs. Hofstede had offered her the house at $480 a month before the hour was up. "I charge less than I could," Mrs. Hofstede had said, with the frankness of someone who has decided in their 7th decade that circling the truth is a waste of limited time. "Because I want the kind of people who treat a house the way they'd want to be treated. You seem like that kind." "I am," Clara had said. It was not pride, it was simple fact. The house was small in the way that required commitment to love, not charmingly rustic, not shabby chic, just genuinely modest. The porch sagged at the left corner where a support beam had softened over decades of winters. The paint peeled in long strips on the south-facing wall where the sun worked on it year-round. The furnace made a sound in December that Clara had come to think of as its personality rather than a malfunction, a deep mechanical wheeze that meant I am working, I am working, I am still working. The kitchen had one window that stuck and one faucet that dripped, and a refrigerator old enough that Clara suspected it predated several of the people in town. She had made it beautiful anyway. Not expensively, not in the way of someone with resources who could purchase beauty, in the way of someone who understood that beauty, at its root, is attention, the decision to see what is actually here and arrange it with care. She had sewn curtains from fabric store remnants, a deep amber fabric that caught the afternoon light and turned the small living room golden in the late hours. She had built a bookshelf from reclaimed wood and milk crates that she'd sanded and painted white, and it covered the entire east wall and held more books per square foot than most libraries. She had hung the boys' drawings everywhere on the refrigerator, along the hallway, across every available wall space, an ever-expanding gallery of crayon suns and lopsided houses and figures with circular heads, and 4 lines for limbs that she dated on the back in pencil, so she could track the evolution of their vision. Mason and Miles Reyes were 2 years and 4 months old. They were identical in the way that suggested the universe had made one extraordinary decision, and then, pleased with the result, made it again. The same warm brown complexion, Clara's coloring, her father's coloring, the specific golden brown of the Reyes family that went back generations. The same small nose, the same lower lip that protruded very slightly when they were concentrating, giving them both a permanent air of profound deliberation. And the same eyes. Storm gray, Nathan Blackwell's eyes, in 2 small faces that had no idea yet what those eyes meant or where they came from. Clara looked at those eyes every morning and felt something that was not quite grief and not quite love, but lived in the space between them, a feeling for which she had never found the right word and had stopped trying to name. Mason was the elder by 4 minutes, though Miles had never accepted this hierarchy as meaningful. Mason was methodical, serious, inclined to examine things before touching them. He had recently become interested in how doors worked, not in opening them, but in the mechanism, the hinges and the latch and the question of what made them stay closed. He had asked Clara 3 separate times to explain this, and each time her explanation had satisfied him for approximately 1 day before the question re-emerged in a slightly different form. Miles was kinetic where Mason was still, verbal where Mason was observational. He had been speaking in full sentences since 20 months, which the pediatrician in Henderson had noted with interest. He narrated his own experience continuously. "I am eating the cracker is broken. I did not break it, the cracker was already broken. This is important information," in a voice that carried the earnest conviction of someone filing a report. Clara loved them with the specific, undiluted intensity of someone who has organized their entire life around a single essential thing, and has found the thing worthy of the organization. She worked 3 jobs. She rose at 5:15 every morning, not an alarm. She had trained herself out of needing one, and was at Patsy's diner by 6 for the breakfast and early lunch shift. She was home by 2:30, when the woman next door, Linda Oakes, a retired teacher who had become, without either of them formally deciding on it, the boys' daytime caregiver in exchange for compensation that Clara paid before she paid any other bill, brought Mason and Miles back from their morning walk. From 3 until 6, she did remote administrative work for a small insurance office in Indianapolis, handling correspondence and data entry, and occasionally, with their permission, drafting letters that were so precisely structured and clearly written that the office manager had once said, half joking, "You sure you don't want to work in legal?" Clara had smiled and said nothing. From 7 until 9, when the boys were asleep, she did bookkeeping for 2 local businesses, a hardware store and a small landscaping company, paid in cash because they preferred it, and she needed every dollar without deduction. She slept 5 hours on good nights, 4 on bad ones. She had not bought herself a new piece of clothing in 14 months. She cut her own hair. She made the boys Halloween costumes from materials she already owned. She comparison shopped every grocery item and planned meals 2 weeks in advance to eliminate waste. She knew exactly how much money she needed to clear each month and how much margin she had, and the margin was never more than $200, and sometimes it was less than that, and sometimes it was nothing, and she absorbed the difference with the same quiet, practiced steadiness she brought to everything. What she had, she gave to Mason and Miles without remainder. New shoes when the old ones pinched. The inhaler for Miles's mild asthma, paid out of pocket, $340 a refill, because the insurance gap was $340 and the alternative was not available. Books, stacks of them, organized by age range and interest, refreshed through the library's sales shelf and a Facebook group where Millbrook parents exchanged children's books. Whole milk, not skim. Fresh vegetables, not frozen. She had never told anyone who their father was. Not Linda Oakes, who watched them 5 days a week. Not Mrs. Hofstede, who left soup on the porch and had never once asked who was raising these boys alone. Not the pediatrician in Henderson. Not her sister Rosa, who called every Sunday and had accepted, with a grace that Clara was quietly grateful for, that there were answers Clara was not yet giving. She had, however, continued to maintain everything. The cloud account, updated periodically with any new documentation she could access. The employment records. The confidentiality agreement, which she had sent to a paralegal she'd found through a legal aid referral to review, and which the paralegal had confirmed contained a fraud exemption clause. The email printout, Cassandra's email to Marcus Webb, stored in a waterproof folder inside a fireproof box under her bed. She was not sure what she was building. She was sure that whatever came next would require foundations, and she was laying them the only way available to her, one careful document at a time, in a house on a dirt road in a town that Chicago had forgotten existed, while 2 small boys grew up healthy and loved, and completely unaware that they were the center of a deception worth billions. One morning in October, a Tuesday, the same day of the week as the night Nathan had first found her reading a brief in a hallway, Clara was making pancakes when she saw an unfamiliar SUV with Illinois plates slow at the end of Sycamore Road. It stopped. She stood at the kitchen window with the spatula in her hand and watched it sit there, engine running, and something moved through her that she could not immediately identify. Then she recognized it. It was the thing she had been waiting for. She turned off the burner. She wiped her hands on the dish towel. She picked up her phone and checked that the cloud account was accessible and that the folder under the bed was where she'd left it. Then she went to the living room and told the boys to keep their shoes on, because something told her they were going to need them. Detective Ray Ockafer had a rule about coincidences. They didn't exist. In 11 years working financial crimes for the Illinois State Police, he had investigated 43 cases involving the deliberate manipulation of evidence, the concealment of assets, or the construction of false narratives to achieve a financial objective. In 43 cases, what appeared at the outset to be coincidence had, without exception, proven upon investigation to be design. He was 46, a compact man with a close-cropped beard going silver at the jaw, wearing the same style of dark suit he had worn every working day for 20 years, because consistency of appearance required no mental energy, and he preferred to spend his mental energy on the work. He had a daughter in her second year at Northwestern, and an ex-wife in Evanston with whom he had, over the decade since their divorce, achieved a relationship of genuine mutual respect that most of their married friends considered more functional than their own arrangements. He was not impressed by money. This was not a moral position, it was experiential. He had spent 11 years watching what money did to people and what people did for money, and the view from that vantage point produced not admiration but a kind of clinical detachment that made him very good at his job. The encrypted message had arrived on a Thursday morning through the financial crimes tip line, a secure portal that received an average of 12 submissions a week, 11 of which were either irrelevant, malformed, or submitted by people who had confused financial crimes with other categories of injustice. The 12th, on this particular Thursday, was none of those things. Ray read it once at his desk. Then he closed his office door, which he did not usually bother to do, and read it twice more. The message contained 3 components. First, a scanned copy of an email header intact, timestamp verified from an address registered to a Cassandra Holt to an address associated with a man named Marcus Webb, reading in its entirety. The Maid situation needs to be resolved before Q4. Make it clean. Make it permanent. I don't care what you use. Second, a series of financial records showing 17 transactions totaling $340,000 between a Delaware-registered shell company, Centaura Consulting LLC, and a personal account registered to Marcus Webb, spread across a 14-month period. Third, a name and address and a brief note that read, Clara Reyes, 14 Sycamore Road, Millbrook, Indiana. She has been raising Nathan Blackwell's children alone for over 2 years. She was wrongfully terminated using fabricated evidence. The children do not know their father. Their father does not know the children exist. It was signed, a friend of the truth. Ray sat with this for a full minute. Then he opened his laptop and began. Marcus Webb was his first search, because Marcus Webb was a name he had encountered before, not in connection with anything he'd personally investigated, but in a case file that had crossed his desk 2 years ago from the Cook County Fraud Unit, a witness tampering charge that had been plea bargained down and resulted in a fine and probation. Webb had a pattern. He worked through intermediaries, maintained documentation discipline, and chose clients carefully. He was, by the standards of his occupation, professional. Centaura Consulting, LLC, dissolved his professionalism in approximately 40 minutes of database work. The Delaware registration was recent, 3 years and 2 months ago, around the time the email was sent. The registered agent was a law firm that specialized in nominee services. The beneficial owner, buried under 2 layers of corporate structure but findable with the right databases and enough patience, was a woman named Catherine Mercer Holt, Cassandra's mother, living in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. It was not a coincidence. Ray spent the next 2 weeks moving carefully. He requested Marcus Webb's complete financial records through a subpoena he kept narrow enough not to trigger alerts. He cross-referenced the transaction timeline with the timeline in the tip. The 14 months of payments aligned precisely with the period described. Pre-termination surveillance, the termination operation itself, and the post-termination monitoring of Clara Reyes. He had a forensic accountant verify the shell company trail independently. He also quietly identified Priya Mehta. This was the piece that connected the documentation to the source, because the encrypted tip had been sent from a public library terminal in Chicago's Wicker Park neighborhood, and the library's sign-in records showed, for that specific terminal at that specific time, a library card registered to Priya Maid, address in Logan Square. Ray had pulled Priya's employment record. Executive assistant to Nathan Blackwell at Blackwell Global. Employed 3 years and 4 months. He had not contacted Priya directly. Not yet. He was building the case in layers because the moment anyone at Blackwell Tower knew that a financial crimes detective was asking questions, information would move and people would lawyer up and the window would narrow. But he had driven past the building twice. Not surveillance, just orientation. Getting the geography of the thing into his body before it moved into his mind. Priya Maid was 29 years old, the daughter of Indian immigrants who had worked very hard so that she could have the kind of professional opportunity that her parents had not. She had been brilliant in school, consistently at the top of her class, organized beyond anyone's ability to use organization against her, possessed of a memory for detail that bordered on the photographic. She had taken the position at Blackwell Global 3 years ago because it was the kind of credential that opened doors, and she had spent those 3 years working harder than she had ever worked while slowly, incrementally, almost invisibly, being managed, manipulated, and diminished by Cassandra Holt. It had begun subtly, the kind of subtle that is designed to be deniable, a comment in a meeting that redirected credit, a task added to Priya's list with the implicit suggestion that Cassandra had done her a favor by delegating it, a pattern of information sharing that gave Priya what she needed to do her job while ensuring she never had the full picture of anything. Cassandra had understood, instinctively, that a sharp assistant with too much visibility was a liability, and she had spent 3 years ensuring that Priya's considerable intelligence was kept pointed away from anything that might matter. What Cassandra had not accounted for was the accumulating weight of being underestimated. It is a specific kind of damage, that weight, different from being disliked, different from being overworked, different from the ordinary frustrations of professional life. It is the damage that comes from having your perceptions managed, from slowly realizing that someone has been treating your intelligence as a threat to be contained rather than an asset to be used. It produces, in people who have been underestimated their whole lives and have spent considerable energy refusing to accept that assessment, a very particular kind of fury. Priya had spent 18 months noticing things she was not supposed to notice. She had noticed when Cassandra's calendar showed appointments with no location and no subject that corresponded with decisions that subsequently appeared in Nathan's professional environment. She had noticed that a filing system Cassandra had reorganized 8 months ago had made certain historical emails harder to retrieve, not inaccessible, but buried in a way that looked like organizational preference and functioned like selective concealment. She had noticed that Nathan's personal communication lines had, quietly and without announcement, developed a filter pattern for certain senders. She had noticed, and this was the thing that had finally moved her from observation to action, that when she had, 4 months ago, received a call from a woman who identified herself as Clara Reyes and said she was a former employee trying to reach Mr. Blackwell on an urgent personal matter, the protocol she had been trained to follow, which was to take a message and pass it to Nathan's personal line, had been superseded by a note in the communication management system that directed all contact from Clara Reyes to a specific folder. A folder Priya had access to. A folder that Cassandra reviewed. Priya had sat with this for 6 weeks. Then she had gone to a public library in Wicker Park on a Wednesday afternoon and done what needed to be done. She had not told anyone. She had returned to her desk the following morning and processed Nathan's schedule and answered his calls and managed his correspondence with the same precise efficiency she had always brought to the work. She had not told Ray Akafer her name, but Ray Akafer, who had spent 11 years being told things indirectly, had found her library card. He had called Dennis Park, Nathan's personal attorney, on a Friday afternoon. Dennis Park had said, after a silence that lasted long enough for Ray to count his own heartbeats, "Send me everything." And then Dennis had made a different call. To Nathan. Nathan Blackwell had not slept in 36 hours. This was not unusual for him. He had pushed past that threshold before, during the worst stretches of the Blackwell reconstruction, and had learned that the human body, under sufficient pressure, will keep moving well past the point where it has any rational business doing so. But those previous stretches of sleeplessness had been powered by the specific fuel of professional crisis, the clean adrenaline of identifiable problems with identifiable solutions. This was different. This was the kind of sleeplessness that comes from sitting with a truth that has rearranged everything, that has reached back through 3 years of your life and rewritten the context of everything you believed was solid, and not being able to put it down long enough to rest. Dennis Park had called him on Friday evening. Nathan had read the preliminary documents Dennis sent over in 20 minutes, then read them again, then called Dennis back and said 3 words: "Get everything certified." He had not called Cassandra. He had spent a considerable amount of the following 36 hours actively choosing not to call Cassandra, because calling Cassandra would give her the one thing she had always been most dangerous when she had it: information about where the threat was coming from. He had spent those 36 hours in his home office, not the tower, his apartment, reviewing the documents that Dennis and Ray Ackerfer had assembled. The shell company trail, the payment records, Marcus Webb's background. The edited security footage, which a forensic video analyst had now confirmed showed evidence of digital manipulation in 2 specific frames. The email. The Maid situation needs to be resolved before Q4. Make it clean. Make it permanent. He had read that sentence, Cassandra's sentence, her specific words, her deliberate instruction more times than he could count, and each time it produced a response in him that was not quite any single emotion but the compound result of several arriving simultaneously: fury, self-recrimination, grief, and underneath all of it, a guilt so precise and so heavy that it sat in his chest like a stone. He had fired Clara, not Cassandra. Nathan Blackwell had sat across his own desk from a woman who had worked for him with extraordinary integrity, who had handed him a legal brief with annotated notes, and then spent 18 months running his household with quiet, competent grace, who had looked him in the eye and said, "I am asking you what you believe," and he had said nothing. He had chosen the folder. He could not reverse that. He could not go back to that office and that silence and make a different decision. The silence had happened. The folder had won. And whatever came from that, whatever 2 years and 4 months in a small Indiana house at the end of a dirt road had cost Clara Reyes, he had not prevented it. He had not prevented it because he had not believed her. That was the thing he kept returning to in those 36 sleepless hours. Not Cassandra's crime, as enormous as it was. His own failure of judgment, of instinct, of the basic human obligation to hold someone's word against evidence rather than automatically beneath it. He had, when it mattered, chosen certainty over trust, and certainty had been manufactured. He was in the back of a black SUV on a Tuesday morning, heading south out of Chicago when Dennis Park said, "You don't have to be the one who goes." "I do," Nathan said. He was looking at the file in his hands without reading it. He had stopped reading it hours ago. He knew every word. There are protocols for this. We can send a representative, make the initial contact through proper channels. Dennis. Nathan's voice was quiet, final. "I know." Dennis said nothing else. The SUV drove 3 hours south and east. Down interstates that became state highways that became 2-lane roads that passed through towns Nathan had never had reason to enter. Small places with grain elevators and water towers painted with town names. Places that operated on a completely different scale than the world he spent his life in. He watched them pass and felt, in an uncharacteristic and uncomfortable way, very large and very insufficient at the same time. Millbrook appeared without announcement, a sign on the county road, a traffic light, a main street that was the right size for the number of people who needed to use it. The driver navigated through town and out the other side, following the address that Dennis had confirmed, turning onto Sycamore Road. The SUV slowed. Nathan looked up from the file. The house was at the end of the road, a small, weathered structure that was doing its best with what it had. The kind of house that communicated, simply by existing, an entire story about the conditions under which someone had been living. The porch sagged. The paint had surrendered to the elements on the south wall. A porch light was on in full daylight because one of the two bulbs had blown, and the remaining one was compensating with a permanent yellow glow. On the porch steps were two pairs of small sneakers. Identical, side by side, muddy at the toes. Nathan looked at those sneakers for a long moment. Something happened in his chest that he did not have a name for, not the disciplined, bounded feelings he was accustomed to managing, but something older and more structural, like a weight-bearing wall discovering for the first time that it is weight-bearing. He got out of the car. He walked up the path, cracked concrete, a dandelion growing through the middle crack with magnificent indifference, and stepped onto the porch and knocked. Silence. Then footsteps. The door opened, and Clara Reyes stood in front of him for the first time in 2 years and 4 months, and the first thing Nathan Blackwell registered before anything else, before the grief or the guilt or the legal and logistical enormity of what had brought him here, was that she had known he was coming. She was not surprised. She had made coffee. He could smell it behind her in the warmth of the small house, and the detail undid him more than any document had. "Nathan," she said. He opened his mouth. He had prepared words. Dennis had, in fact, helped him prepare words, a careful, legally informed opening that acknowledged the situation without constituting an admission before the appropriate documentation was in place. None of the words arrived. Because from inside the house, behind Clara, came the sound, immediate, vivid, and completely indifferent to the enormity of the adult moment at the threshold, of two small boys arguing at full commitment about something that mattered to them enormously. They came running toward the door, as small children run, which is to say with the total physical commitment of creatures who have not yet learned to hold anything back. They stopped when they saw the stranger on the porch. Nathan Blackwell looked down. Mason and Miles looked up, and the universe, with the quiet, absolute efficiency of things that have been arranged from a great distance, rearranged itself around that moment. There was a particular quality to the silence that followed. Not the silence of an empty room or the silence of people choosing not to speak, but the silence of a moment that is too large for sound. The kind that arrives when something irreversible has just happened, and everyone present is still in the process of understanding what it was. Nathan Blackwell, who had stood in front of boardrooms and courtrooms and the beds of hospitals where people he loved were dying, and had not broken in any of those places. Nathan Blackwell stood on a sagging porch in Millbrook, Indiana, and looked down at his sons for the first time, and felt every wall he had spent 4 years building develop, simultaneously, a crack. They were so small. He had known they would be small. He had their ages, had done the calculation, had intellectually processed that they were toddlers. But intellectual processing and physical reality are different countries, and he had not been prepared for the specific, vertiginous reality of two small humans standing in front of him with his eyes in their faces, looking up at him with the patient, assessing quality that he recognized because he had seen it every morning in his own mirror for 34 years. Miles, the smaller of the two, the one whose slightly more deliberate physicality marked him as the one Clara would later tell Nathan was technically born first, tilted his head at a precise angle, the angle of someone working through a problem. "Are you lost?" Miles asked. Nathan's throat closed completely. He had the specific, humiliating experience of standing there, $4.7 billion, $4 years of demonstrated implacability, a reputation for emotional control that had become something of a legend among people who negotiated against him, completely unable to respond to a 2-year-old's question. He stopped. The word had nowhere to go. He tried again. "I might be," he said. "I think I might be." Miles received this answer with the gravity it deserved, which was considerable. He looked at Nathan for another long moment, then looked at his mother, then back at Nathan. Mason, meanwhile, had been conducting his own assessment from a slightly different angle, literally, as he had taken 2 steps to the left to view the stranger from a new vantage. He had not yet spoken. He was not ready to speak yet. He was still in the information-gathering phase. Clara had one hand pressed flat against the doorframe. Nathan could see, in the controlled set of her shoulders, the effort she was making, not toward anger or accusation, but toward steadiness. The steadiness of someone who has been carrying something very heavy and is not yet certain whether they are being offered help or simply a new kind of weight. "Come inside," she said. She stepped back from the door, and Nathan followed her into the house that had been his son's entire world. And the first thing he noticed, past the size of it, past the worn furniture and the peeling wallpaper, were the drawings. They covered every available surface. The refrigerator, the hallway, the wall above the bookshelf. Dozens of crayon drawings, each one dated in pencil on the visible edge. A gallery stretching back what appeared to be more than a year, from the simple geometric shapes of early artistic effort to increasingly complex compositions that showed, even to Nathan's entirely inexperienced eye, an evolving intentionality. He looked at the drawings and understood in the wordless way that important understandings often arrive, that these walls were not decorated, they were loved. "Sit down," Clara said, moving to the kitchen. "Coffee?" "Yes," Nathan said because he had to say something. He sat at the small kitchen table. Dennis Park had remained outside with the driver. Nathan had been clear about that. Whatever happened in the first 5 minutes of this was not a legal event. It was something else. Miles had followed them into the kitchen and positioned himself at the end of the table, maintaining his assessment of Nathan with the focused attention of a professional appraiser. Mason had gone back to something on the floor of the living room that, from this angle, appeared to be an elaborate arrangement of blocks organized by some system whose logic was not immediately apparent. "He's building a gate," Miles said, noticing the direction of Nathan's gaze. "He says gates keep things safe. He's been working on it since Tuesday." "Does it work?" Nathan asked. Miles considered this with full seriousness. "He thinks so. I think a gate has to latch to work. His doesn't latch yet." "He's still figuring out the latch," Nathan said. "Yes," Miles said. "He always figures things out. It takes him a while, but he always does." Nathan looked at this small person with his eyes, telling him with complete unself-consciousness something true about his brother, and felt something break open in his chest that he recognized distantly as the specific sensation of grief meeting love meeting guilt all at once, a compound feeling so large it had no container. Clara set coffee in front of him and sat across the table. She did not say. "Where have you been?" She did not say. "Do you know what these 2 years have cost?" She did not perform suffering at him, did not weaponize the specifics of what she had endured, did not make him look at the house and the worn furniture and the shoes drying by the door and understand the equation of sacrifice that had produced them. She simply sat across the table, her hands wrapped around her own mug, and waited. And that restraint, that absolute, extraordinary restraint, was more devastating than any accusation could have been. "Need you to know." Nathan said that I didn't. He stopped. The sentence he'd started had 6 possible endings and all of them were inadequate. "Know what you didn't know," Clara said. "That's why you're here." "I'm here because someone sent evidence to a financial crimes detective," Nathan said. "I'm here because I read a file for 36 hours straight and I couldn't." He stopped again, looked at the table, looked up at her. "I'm here because I should have believed you." Silence that followed was different from the silence on the porch. The porch silence had been too large for sound. This silence was the specific silence of a sentence landing on someone who has been waiting to receive it and not quite knowing, after all the waiting, what to do with it. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "We need to do a DNA test," she said. "Not because I need it, because what comes next will need it." "I know," Nathan said. "I've already made the arrangements." "I have preliminary results already," she said. "Independent, private lab." He looked at her. "Been preparing for this," she said simply. Of course she had. Of course she had spent 2 years not just surviving but preparing, building the case, maintaining the documentation, ensuring that when this moment arrived, it arrived with irrefutable foundations. He thought about the girl who had stood in a hallway at 11 o'clock at night, annotating a legal brief she'd found in a recycling pile. He thought about what it had cost her that the person who should have seen her most clearly had, at the crucial moment, looked away. "Miles," Clara said, turning to the boy still standing at the table's edge. "Why don't you go help your brother figure out the latch?" Miles looked at Nathan one more time, a final assessment, a provisional conclusion he was not yet ready to fully commit to, and then went. Nathan watched him go. When he turned back, Clara was watching him with an expression he couldn't fully read, part wariness, part something older, more complicated. "They don't know," she said quietly. "I know. They will, soon, I think." She looked toward the living room where the low sound of Mason's concentrated work continued. "Miles already asks. He asks carefully, which is how he asks everything. He says, 'Where do gray eyes come from?' He says it like it's a geography question." Nathan pressed his hands flat on the table and breathed. "Tell me what they need," he said. "Right now, today." She looked at him for a long moment. And then Clara Reyes, who had managed every single thing alone for 2 years and 4 months, who had never once asked anyone for anything she wasn't prepared to handle the absence of, told him. The inhaler, the furnace, the winter coats, 3 phone calls, 4 minutes, done. After the boys were settled, Miles with a picture book, Mason still devoted to the gate, Clara placed a manila folder on the table between them. It was not a thin folder. Nathan looked at it without touching it. The tab was labeled in Clara's handwriting, small, precise, the handwriting of someone who had learned early that clarity on paper prevents arguments later. "I found the email 8 weeks before you fired me," Clara said. She did not say before you let her fire me. She said before you fired me, because she had spent a long time deciding how to describe that moment and had concluded that accuracy required his ownership of it. It was misfiled in a stack of documents I was organizing. I almost didn't read it. It was in a sealed envelope that had been opened and resealed badly. She had almost not read it. Nathan thought about the universe's logistics, the specific sequence of events, the misfiled envelope, the badly resealed flap, the moment Clara had decided to read rather than refile, and felt the vertigo of how easily none of this could have happened, how easily the truth could have stayed buried. "I photographed it on my phone," Clara continued. "Sent the photo to an encrypted cloud account I opened that same afternoon. I filed the original back exactly where I'd found it." She paused. "I'd had enough law school to know that chain of custody matters." Nathan opened the folder. The first item was the email, printed clear, header intact. "The Maid situation needs to be resolved before Q4. Make it clean. Make it permanent. I don't care what you use." He had read this email 40 times in the past 36 hours. Reading it in this kitchen at this table, 12 feet from where his sons were playing, was different from reading it in his apartment. Here it had weight that it hadn't had in the abstract. "Why didn't you contact me immediately?" he asked. "I tried." Her voice was steady. "Twice. Your personal email produced no response. The building's main line told me you were unavailable and that all communications regarding former employees should go through HR." She looked at him. "The third time, someone responded to your personal email and told me that further contact would be referred to legal." Nathan looked up from the folder. "Never received those contacts," he said. "I know," she said. "I figured that out later, when I understood more fully what she was capable of." He thought about Priya, about the communication filter Priya had found in Nathan's system, the folder that routed all contact from Clara Reyes to Cassandra's review. His own communication infrastructure, used against the people it was supposed to serve. He felt the fury move through him in a clean, cold wave. "I was 6 weeks pregnant when I left Chicago," Clara said. "I didn't know it when you fired me. I found out 2 weeks later." He had known this from the file, the timeline Dennis had reconstructed, the medical records they'd been able to access, the due date that worked backward to a night he remembered with perfect clarity, a night that had existed in his memory for 3 years as the single thing he had not been able to fully categorize. "I would have," he started. "I know," she said. "I know you would have." She said it without bitterness, without even particular certainty. She said it the way you say a thing you've decided to believe because the alternative requires too much energy. "But I couldn't reach you. and I had to make decisions based on what I could do, not what you might have done. Folder contained a meticulous chronology, every employment record, every pay stub. The signed confidentiality agreement, annotated with the specific fraud exemption clause her paralegal contact had identified. Photographs of the security footage timestamp discrepancies that a neighbor's nephew, a computer science student home for summer, who Clara had told only that she suspected footage had been edited, had helped her identify from the publicly available building security court documents filed in an unrelated case. There were also records of her attempts to contact Nathan Scree. Screenshots, timestamps, email server receipts showing delivery to his personal account. And at the back of the folder, in its own transparent sleeve, was the preliminary DNA result from the private lab she had accessed 6 months ago, when she had determined that the preparation needed to be complete. Nathan picked it up. 99.97% paternity. Preliminary, single lab, but technically sound. The two boys named in the document, Mason Rodrigo Reyes and Miles Elias Reyes, were identified as the biological sons of a sample donor whose markers matched, at 99.97%, a publicly available genetic dataset that Clara had been able to cross-reference through a genealogy database using Nathan's published family genetic markers from a charity DNA initiative he had participated in 3 years ago. Miles Elias, he had named his son with Nathan's father's name. He sat with that for a moment. "Elias," he said. "Your father's name is public," Clara said. She was watching him carefully. "I wanted him to have something real, even if he didn't know where it came from yet." Nathan set the paper down. He pressed both palms flat on the table and looked at the grain of the wood, old, worn smooth in places from years of use, and he breathed. Outside the kitchen window, Millbrook continued its quiet Tuesday. A truck passed on the road. Mrs. Hofstede's tabby cat moved through the yard with the authority of an animal who has decided that all visible territory belongs to it. From the living room came the sound of Miles reading aloud to himself, a murmured recitation, earnest and slightly wrong in the pronunciation of some words, perfect in the commitment to every one of them. "I need to tell you something," Nathan said. He was still looking at the table. Then he looked up. "What I said to you, what I didn't say to you in my office that day, I should have believed you. I should have said that out loud. Before anything else, I should have said it." Clara looked at him for a long time. "Yes," she said, "you should have." She didn't dress it up. She didn't soften it with reassurance he hadn't earned or forgiveness he hadn't asked for properly. She received his acknowledgement with the same direct, unhurried honesty that she brought to everything, and she let it be what it was. "What happens now?" she asked. "I have 2 independent labs flying in tomorrow for official DNA testing," Nathan said. "Chain of custody certified, admissible in any court in the country. I have my attorney coordinating with Detective Ockhaffer on the financial crimes case against Cassandra and Webb." He paused. "And I have a decision I need to make about timing." "What decision?" He looked at her. "Cassandra has a party planned in 3 days," he said. "An engagement party, 300 people, the full board, investors, press adjacency." He was quiet for a moment. "She built the stage. I'm thinking about what to do with it." Clara looked at him steadily. Something moved across her face, not triumph, not satisfaction, but something more complex. The expression of someone who has been waiting, patient as stone, for the truth to find its level and is now watching it do so. "Whatever you decide," she said, "make sure it's complete. Make sure there's nowhere to hide afterward." Nathan held her gaze. "There won't be," he said. From the living room, Miles's voice floated through. "Mason, I think the problem is the hinge, not the latch." Mason, after a pause, said, "Show me." Nathan closed the folder. He had everything he needed. The engagement party invitation had been designed by a firm in New York that charged $400 per piece and specialized in what their website described as heirloom correspondence. The kind of invitation so beautiful it became an artifact, something guests kept rather than recycled. 300 of them had been sent. 300 people had confirmed attendance. Cassandra Holt stood in the living room of Nathan's penthouse. Her living room, in 4 weeks, she had made a practice of thinking of it this way because inhabiting ownership in your mind before it is legally established is a technique for people who understand that reality is partly constructed, and reviewed the seating chart on her tablet with the focused attention of a general reviewing troop positions the night before engagement. She was exceptional at this. The social architecture of a room, who sits near whom, who needs to see what from which angle, which alliances get reinforced by proximity, and which rivalries get managed by distance, was a language she had been fluent in since long before she had money to work with. At her consulting firm in New York, she had been famous for her client events. Cassandra knows how to put people in the right place, a former colleague had said, and had meant it as professional compliment, without understanding that it described something that extended well past event planning. She was placing Gerald Fitch at a table with 2 board members who had been mildly skeptical of her. Proximity to Fitch would remind them of the network he represented, the old money credibility that she had borrowed from him, and that continued to pay compound returns. She was placing 3 of Nathan's major investment partners near the front, where they would be among the first to congratulate, a position that translated subtly into an endorsement they hadn't explicitly given. She was placing the 2 journalists who had been invited, not reporters, but editors who moved in the social world where the personal and professional were indistinct, at a table where they would hear exactly what she intended them to hear. It was a masterpiece, as these things went. She had not heard from Nathan since morning. This was not alarming. He had a meridian finalization meeting, a call with the Singapore office, and a board prep session scheduled. A full day, by any measure, and Nathan in a full day was Nathan in a tunnel, completely concentrated on what was in front of him. He did not make social calls from tunnels. She had, however, noticed that the unmarked slot on his morning calendar, 4 hours, no location, no subject, had not been explained when she'd casually asked Priya about it. He blocked it himself, Priya had said, with the particular flatness of someone giving the literal truth of a thing while withholding the emotional context. I don't have details. Cassandra had noted this and moved on. Then at 2 p.m. Marcus Webb had called. He went to Indiana, Marcus said. I lost the tail after Kankakee, but I tracked his attorney's phone signal to a county outside of Henderson. There's only one address in that county connected to what you know about. Cassandra had set down her tablet very carefully, with the deliberate control of someone managing the urge to throw it. How long ago? She asked. He arrived this morning, around 10. She did the arithmetic. 4 hours there, an unknown number of hours on site. He could be returning now, or he could already be back, sitting in his office with whatever he had found, deciding what to do with it. She called Gerald Fitch. Gerald, she said when he answered, I may need to move something up. A pause. Cassandra. His voice had an unfamiliar quality, not reluctance exactly, but a new resistance, like a door she was accustomed to pushing through that had been recently reinforced. I've been meaning to call you, actually. Then call me. What is it? I had a conversation this afternoon, Fitch said slowly, with an attorney I respect very much. He asked me some questions about Centaura Consulting LLC. The room went very still. I don't know that name, Cassandra said. Cassandra. Fitch's voice was the voice of a man who has been in politics long enough to know what a sinking ship sounds like. I think you should speak to your attorney. Tonight. He ended the call. Cassandra held the phone for a moment. She called Marcus Webb back. They know about Centaura, she said. Applause. How? I don't know how. I need you to. Cassandra. Marcus's voice had changed. The professional fluency, the operational calm she'd relied on for 3 years was not quite present. I received a call this afternoon from an investigator. They want to discuss my financial records. Don't say anything, she said immediately. Call your attorney. I have a lawyer, Marcus said. My lawyer is saying the same thing my instincts are saying, which is that when investigators call about financial records at the same time, a major client's target goes to Indiana. That is not a coincidence. Marcus. I'll be in touch, he said, and he ended the call. Cassandra set the phone on the table next to the seating chart. She looked at the room, at the life she had built, the penthouse she was going to own in 4 weeks. The empire she was 3 weeks from inheriting access to. She looked at all of it with the ruthlessly clear eyes of someone running the numbers and finding that the numbers were changing. But Cassandra Holt had not survived what she had survived, had not built what she had built, had not come from nothing to this by capitulating at the first sign of pressure. She had contingencies. She pulled up a document on her phone, an encrypted file she maintained with the same discipline that Clara maintained her folder under the bed, though for entirely different purposes. Inside was a strategy she had built 9 months ago, when she had first assessed the risk profile of the situation. The strategy assumed that at some point Nathan might receive some version of some information. It accounted for that possibility. It had responses. She had character witnesses. She had a version of events that positioned her actions as protective rather than predatory. She had worried about Clara Reyes' instability, had brought the evidence to Nathan out of genuine concern, had never intended. She had documents she had been maintaining that, out of context, could create enough confusion to muddy the clearer narrative. She had time. The party was 3 days away. In 3 days, in front of 300 people, Nathan would stand beside her, and whatever version of events was currently developing would be complicated enormously by the public performance of their commitment. Because Cassandra understood something about powerful men that was both true and useful, they hated being embarrassed more than they hated being wrong. She called her attorney. She began building the defense. She did not know about Priya. She did not know that the tip had come from inside her own operational environment, from the person she had spent 3 years treating as a sophisticated instrument rather than a human being with observation skills and a breaking point. She did not know that Marcus Webb, on a call with his own attorney later that evening, would begin the conversation that would end with him agreeing to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentencing recommendation. She did not know that Ray Ockhaffer, at that same moment, was signing documents that would be served before the end of the week. She did not know. She had been for 3 years the most informed person in any room she occupied. She had just become, for the first time, the least. The medical team arrived at 14 Sycamore Road on Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock. 3 technicians from a private biomedical firm in Chicago, flown down and driven out the previous evening, staying overnight in Henderson because there was nowhere to stay in Millbrook that wasn't someone's spare room. They arrived in a white van that was conspicuously unmarked and parked with the careful alignment of people who have been told that discretion is a professional requirement on this job. The supervising physician was Dr. Ann Carmichael, 54, clinical and thorough, with the specific bedside manner of someone who has spent 3 decades collecting biological samples in emotionally charged situations and has learned that the most useful thing she can do is be completely predictable. She shook Clara's hand first, then Nathan's. She crouched down to the boy's eye level and introduced herself by first name. "I'm Anne," she said. "I'm going to put a little stick in your cheek. It doesn't hurt. It feels like touching the inside of your cheek with your finger." Miles considered this. "Which cheek?" "Either one, you can choose." Miles chose left. Mason, after learning that Miles had chosen left, chose right, because Mason was working on a theory of complementarity that he had not yet articulated, but that was visible in his behavior if you watched for it. Nathan watched the procedure from the kitchen doorway. The collection was completed in 20 minutes. Sealed, labeled, photographed, co-signed by Dr. Carmichael and Dennis Park as independent witnesses, loaded into a temperature-controlled case that would go directly to 2 separate laboratories, one in Chicago, one in a certified facility in Cincinnati, by courier that afternoon. The chain of custody was absolute. There would be no challenge to these results that had any chance of surviving. When the team had packed up and the van had pulled out of the driveway, Clara stood at the kitchen window and watched it go. She heard Nathan come to stand behind her. Not close, appropriate distance, the distance of 2 people navigating something enormous with care. 72 hours, he said. Both labs are expediting. She nodded. Clara. She turned. He was standing in the kitchen of the house where his sons had grown up without him, wearing a suit that cost more than her annual rent. And he looked for the first time, for possibly the first time since she had ever known him, completely without armor. When they come back, he said, I want you to know that nothing about how this proceeds will happen without your input. Every decision about what comes next, I will not make unilaterally. Not anymore. She held his gaze. That's important, she said. Say it again when there's an attorney in the room. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the beginning of the muscular memory of one. I'll say it in front of whoever you need, he said. She turned back to the window. From the living room, the sounds of normal life continued. Miles was narrating something. Mason had, apparently, solved the latch problem. There was a small exclamation of satisfaction, followed by the sound of a door latching and unlatching several times as Mason verified the solution with the thoroughness of an engineer running system tests. He's going to be in operations, Nathan said quietly, listening. Or architecture, Clara said. And Miles. She was quiet for a moment. Miles is going to be the one who talks to people, who makes them feel like they've been genuinely heard. She paused. He gets that from you. Nathan looked at her profile. I'm not particularly known for making people feel heard, he said carefully. No, she said, but when you do, you mean it, and people know the difference. She didn't look at him. He does it more freely than you do. He hasn't learned yet to ration it. Nathan said nothing. He understood, from the precision of that observation, that she had not spent 2 years simply surviving. She had spent 2 years paying the kind of attention to these boys that produced knowledge, real, specific, irreplaceable knowledge of who they were. Knowledge that no amount of money or legal recognition or carefully worded paternity documents could substitute for. He was their father. She had been raising them. These were not the same thing. And the gap between them was not going to be closed by good intentions or a DNA result. He understood this. What do you need the next 72 hours to look like? He asked. Clara turned from the window. Normal, she said. I need the boys to have normal. They know something is different, Miles especially. He has his father's eyes and apparently his father's instincts, so. She allowed herself the smallest edge of something, not quite humor, but adjacent to it. He's watching everything. I'll stay at the Henderson Hotel, Nathan said. I won't come back until you call me. She nodded, then, Nathan. He was already turning toward the hallway. The party, she said. Whatever you decide to do, I need you to know that whatever I built here, she gestured, a small, contained gesture that encompassed the kitchen, the drawings on the walls, the sound of Mason testing his latch in the next room, all of it. Whatever I built here, they built too. They built themselves in this house with these walls, with those books and Linda Oaks next door and Mrs. Hofstede's soup on the porch. This isn't a tragedy I need rescued from. He looked at her. I know, he said. Then rescue them from the lie, she said, not from the life. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he walked down the hallway, where Mason was at the door with the new latch, testing it for the 14th time. "Does it work?" Nathan asked. Mason looked up, tested the latch once more. "Yes," he said with great satisfaction. "Good work," Nathan said. Mason considered him. "It's better if both sides hold," he said seriously. Nathan nodded. "That's always true," he said. He walked out to the car, and the door latched behind him, and he sat in the back of the SUV and called Dennis Park and said 3 words. "Friday, the party." The results arrived at 6:47 a.m. on Friday. Both labs, simultaneously, as Nathan had arranged. He had specified that both facilities were to deliver their reports at the same time to the same recipient, because he wanted no window in which one result existed before the other and could be challenged on the basis of confirmation bias. Dennis Park opened the first email on his laptop at his kitchen table and read the number. 99.9998% paternity. He opened the second email. 99.9997% paternity. He called Nathan. Nathan answered before the first ring completed, which meant he had not been asleep. "Both," Dennis said. "Silence." "Nathan." "I heard you," Nathan said. His voice was the voice of a man who has been told a thing he already knew with complete certainty and has discovered that certainty and confirmation are not the same experience. "I heard you." Dennis waited. "Get Ray Acaffer on a call in 2 hours, Nathan said. "Get Stephen Hale, the family law attorney Dennis had identified, the best in Chicago for a paternity and custody matter of this complexity, on the same call. I want the documents certified and filed today." "The engagement party is tonight," Dennis said. "I know when the party is," Nathan said. "Nathan," Dennis chose his words with care. "What you're considering, if that's where this is going, there are legal implications, strategic implications." "She planned an event with 300 witnesses," Nathan said, and his voice had entered the register, the quiet, terminal register, that his board had learned to treat as a declaration rather than a tone. "Board members, investors, press adjacency. She built the audience." Dennis was silent. "I didn't build this stage," Nathan said. "She did. I'm just going to use it." There was, inside the cold logic of this, something that went beyond legal strategy. Dennis knew Nathan well enough to recognize it. This was not merely the most efficient delivery mechanism for maximum impact. This was Nathan Blackwell, who had spent 3 years being managed, positioned, and deceived by a woman who had chosen his public occasions as her primary operational theater, standing up in exactly the venue she had constructed to take it back. There was something else. 3 years ago, in his own office, Nathan had sat across from Clara Reyes and said nothing. He had chosen documentation over human judgment. He had performed the very silence that had sent her to a house in Indiana for 2 years and 4 months. And the silence had happened in private, in his office, with no witnesses, with no moment of public accounting. What Cassandra had done to Clara had been done invisibly, in memos and shell companies and edited security footage, in intercepted emails and managed communication systems. Invisible crimes that had produced invisible consequences. A woman who disappeared, 2 children who grew up without their father, a truth that was buried so deeply that it had required a detective and a whistleblower and 2 years of patient preparation to resurface it. Nathan was going to make it visible. He got to the tower at 8. He spent the morning doing 2 things simultaneously, processing the legitimate business of a Friday. The Meridian merger had in fact closed cleanly, with the liability clause corrected, and executing with Dennis and Ray Acaffer the precise logistics of what would happen at 8 o'clock that evening. Cassandra came to his office at 10. She was composed beautifully, expensively, professionally composed. She wore a dark green dress that was not the party dress but was clearly in the key of tonight. She had, Nathan understood, spent the last 72 hours in the process of reinforcing her position, calls to board members, a lunch with Gerald Fitch, whose content Nathan's attorney had subsequently been briefed on, a quiet conversation with her own legal team. She had been building. She had not been able to build fast enough. "You look tired," she said, sitting across his desk with the ease that she had always deployed like a tool, the ease that said, "I belong here, I have always belonged here, your uncertainty is noted and irrelevant." "I'm fine," he said. "Tonight's going to be wonderful," she said. "The flowers look extraordinary. I went by the ballroom this morning," she smiled. "After tonight everything gets easier, after the wedding." "Cassandra." She paused. "Tonight," he said, "I want you to be there. Whatever else happens, I need you to actually be there." She looked at him with green eyes that were trying to read something in his face, and finding the expression she encountered, controlled, neutral, giving nothing, frustrating in its impenetrability. "Of course I'll be there," she said. "It's my party." "Yes," Nathan said, returning to his computer. "It is." She left. At noon, Nathan called Clara. She answered on the second ring. "The results are certified," he said. 99.9998 and 99.9997. Both labs. Dennis is filing the paternity recognition documents this afternoon. A pause on her end, then okay. "I need you to be there tonight," he said. "You and the boys, I know what I'm asking." A longer pause. "Nathan, Miles has never been in a room with more than 30 people." "He'll be fine," Nathan said, and believed it completely, because Miles had his grandmother's capacity for managing a room and his father's capacity for reading one. "That's not," she stopped, he heard her breathe. "What time?" 8 o'clock. I'll send a car at 6. It'll take 3 hours from Millbrook." "The boys need to eat before," she said. "They get difficult if they're hungry around strangers." "I'll make sure there's food in the car." Another pause, then very quietly, "What's going to happen?" "The truth," Nathan said. "That's all, just the truth." Clara was silent for a moment. "Okay," she said. The Blackwell Tower ballroom on the 40th floor had been converted. This was Cassandra's work, and it was genuinely masterful. Whatever she was also genuinely talented at this specific thing, and the room reflected it. Crystal chandeliers had been brought in to supplement the existing lighting, filling the space with a warm, multi-directional glow that softened the room's corporate geometry without eliminating the grandeur. White orchids in towering arrangements stood at regular intervals, enough of them to give the room a permanent, subtle perfume. The tablecloths were a deep ivory. The bar was top shelf, tended by 3 professionals who had been briefed on the guest preferences list that Cassandra had prepared. The string quartet in the corner played at the perfect volume, present enough to prevent conversational silences from becoming awkward, restrained enough not to intrude on the conversations themselves. 300 guests moved through the room in the specific social choreography of Chicago's elite at a formal occasion. The handshakes and air kisses, the drink-collecting rituals, the careful positioning near the right people at the right moment. Board members in tuxedos, investment partners in suits that communicated their wealth precisely. 2 editors from publications that shaped how Chicago's professional class understood itself. Cassandra stood at the center of it. She wore the gown she had chosen 3 months ago and had kept in preservation packaging in the back of what would soon be her closet in Nathan's penthouse. A deep emerald satin that was deliberately, intelligently not white, because Cassandra understood that weddings were for white and engagement parties were for making clear that you have already won. It had cost $14,000. She had charged it to a credit card she maintained under a different name and had never discussed with Nathan. She moved through her party with the polished ease of someone in their natural element, and if there was, beneath the performance, a very carefully managed undercurrent of tension. If she was tracking the time with unusual attention, if she glanced toward the elevator bank more frequently than the social context required, she had, to the eye of anyone in this room, subsumed it entirely. Gerald Fitch had arrived early. He had shaken her hand with a correctness that contained, in its very precision, a quality of distance that hadn't been there before. She had filed this. At 8:30, Nathan had not arrived. This was, on the surface, Nathan being Nathan. He was chronically last to his own events, because Nathan treated time as a system to be optimized rather than a social agreement to be honored. But tonight, in context, at 8:30, it registered differently. At 8:47, the elevator chimed. The doors opened, and the room began, person by person, table by table, conversation by conversation, to go quiet. Nathan walked in first. He was in a dark suit, no tie, formal but not festive, the suit of a man who had come to do something rather than celebrate something. Behind him, Dennis Park. Behind Dennis, a man in plainclothes whom several of the law-adjacent guests would subsequently identify as law enforcement by the specific quality of his posture. Behind him, a woman holding an attaché case. And behind all of them, behind the lawyers and the detective and the professional precision of people who had come prepared, a woman in a simple navy dress and holding her hands, two small boys in brand-new winter coats. The string quartet stopped playing one instrument at a time, first the cello, then the second violin, then the viola, then the first violin, its final note hanging in the air and then disappearing. The room was very quiet. Cassandra, across the ballroom, turned. She saw Nathan. She saw the people behind him. Then she saw Clara. And then she saw the boys. The boys in their new coats, looking around the room with the assessing curiosity of small people in a large space, taking inventory, the chandeliers, the flowers, the large number of very dressed adults all staring in their direction. Miles characteristically stared back. Mason was already examining the nearest floral arrangement with professional interest. Cassandra stood very still. And in the stillness, something happened to her face. It was a small thing, a micro-expression, a fractional lapse in the comprehensive performance that most people in the room were not positioned to see. Clara saw it. It was fear. Genuine, deep, structural fear. The fear of someone who has built everything on a foundation that is, at this moment, developing its first visible crack. Clara held it. She filed it away. She did not let it show on her face that she had seen it. She held the boy's hands and waited. Nathan began to walk toward the center of the room. Nathan did not take the microphone that a well-meaning events coordinator extended toward him as he passed her station. He didn't need it. The room had produced its own silence, a silence so complete and so instinctively maintained that his ordinary speaking voice would reach every corner. He walked to the center of the ballroom. He stood there. Around him, 300 people held their champagne and their conversations and their social equilibria very still, because something was happening that none of them had a script for, and all of them recognized as significant. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," Nathan said. "I intended for this evening to be a celebration." He paused, a beat. "I've decided it will be something else." There was a sound in the room, not quite a sound, more the collective shift of 300 bodies all adjusting their weight at the same moment. "I'd like to introduce two people," he said. He looked down at the boys. Miles was looking up at him, steady, evaluating, arriving in real time at a conclusion he would carry for the rest of his life. Mason had looked up from the floral arrangement. "Mason and Miles Reyes," Nathan said, "my sons." The room exhaled. Not loudly, not a gasp or an outburst. The specific sound of a large group of people all discovering simultaneously that they don't have enough air and all reaching for more at the same time. Then the whispers began, 100 small eruptions of sound, urgent and disbelieving, building towards something. Nathan raised one hand. The whispers stopped. "Their mother is Clara Reyes," he said. "Some of you may remember her. She worked in this building 3 years ago. She was terminated based on fabricated evidence assembled by a private operative hired to ensure she disappeared." He reached into his jacket pocket. "This is the DNA result from 2 independent laboratories, certified today, confirming paternity." He passed the document to Dennis, who passed it to the nearest board member, Chairman Theodore Aldrich, who received it with the expression of a man being handed an object that is significantly heavier than it looks. Cassandra had been moving through the crowd toward Nathan. She arrived at his side and placed one hand on his arm with the controlled pressure of someone who has practiced managing him through touch. "Nathan." Her voice was pitched for him alone, intimate, calm, the voice of private conversation in a public place, designed to create the impression that this was a misunderstanding between 2 people who knew each other well. "Sweetheart, why don't we?" He stepped away from her hand. One step. Not dramatic, not performative. Just one step, creating a distance of approximately 14 inches, which in the context of a public event in front of 300 people was the distance between 2 entirely different sentences. The room registered it. "I'd also like to introduce Detective Ray Ockhaffer," Nathan continued, "from the Illinois Financial Crimes Unit, who has spent the last 3 weeks reviewing documentation related to the wrongful termination of Clara Reyes and the systematic concealment of her children from their father." Ray stepped forward. He nodded once at the room, professional, contained, acknowledging without performing. "The financial records," Nathan said, and Dennis was opening the portfolio, "show 72 transactions totaling over $300,000 between a Delaware shell company, beneficially owned by a family member of Cassandra Holt, and the personal account of Marcus Webb, a private operative with a documented history of evidence fabrication and witness tampering." He let that settle. "Mr. Webb is currently cooperating with investigators." The word cooperating moved through the room like a current. Gerald Fitch, on the far side of the ballroom, was looking at his phone. Then he put it in his pocket and looked at Theodore Aldrich, who was still holding the DNA report and wearing the expression of a man who is recalculating everything he has signed his name to in the last 6 months. Nathan reached into Dennis's portfolio and removed the laminated copy of the email. He held it up. It read, "The Maid situation needs to be resolved before Q4. Make it clean, make it permanent. I don't care what you use." This email, Nathan said, was sent by Cassandra Holt 9 weeks before Clara Reyes was terminated on the basis of security footage that has since been confirmed, by forensic video analysis, to have been digitally manipulated. He lowered the document. He looked at Cassandra. She was looking at him with green eyes that contained, for the first time in his experience, nothing managed. No calculation, no deployment. Just the raw, unmediated expression of someone watching the floor of every room they've ever occupied give way simultaneously. "For 2 years and 4 months, Nathan said, still looking at her, "my sons lived in a house in Indiana that cost $480 a month to rent. Their mother worked 3 jobs. She slept 5 hours a night. One of them needs an inhaler that costs $340 a refill because she has an insurance gap that she filled with the money she would otherwise have used to buy herself new shoes." He paused. "She did this because the woman standing next to me decided that the existence of my children was an inconvenience to her plans." The room was the most silent Nathan had ever heard it. Not the professional silence of meetings. the existential silence of people who have just understood something that changes the architecture of everything. Cassandra's attorney arrived at her side and said something quietly into her ear. She didn't look at him. She was looking at Clara. Clara stood at the edge of the room, a boy on each side, her hands resting lightly on their shoulders, not performing anything, not triumphant, not angry, not performing pain, just standing in the space where the truth had arrived after a very long journey and simply being present for it. Cassandra looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the boys. Miles looked back at her with his father's eyes. There was no reading what Miles thought of what he saw. He was 2 years old and brilliant, and he was looking at this woman the way he looked at everything, with complete, undivided, utterly unsentimental attention. It was the most devastating thing in the room. More devastating than the email. More devastating than the financial records or the detective's presence or the DNA report in Theodore Aldrich's hands. 2 small boys who simply looked. They almost didn't exist, Nathan said. His voice was very quiet now for her alone. Because of you. The next 12 minutes were the longest in Cassandra Holt's life. She had, in the 43 months since she had begun this plan, encountered moments of pressure. Moments when variables shifted unexpectedly, and she had been required to adapt in real time. She had always adapted. She had always found the next move, the next counter, the next angle from which pressure could be converted into opportunity. She stood in the center of a ballroom she had designed as her coronation. In a dress she had chosen 3 months ago, surrounded by 300 people she had curated, and she could not find the next move. Because there was no next move. Marcus Webb was cooperating. Fitch was already repositioning. The DNA was certified. The email was laminated and had been seen by every person in this room who mattered. And Clara Reyes was standing against the wall with Nathan's sons, and they had their father's eyes, and the eyes were worse than the DNA and worse than the financial records, because the eyes could be seen from across a room without a document or a detective or a legal argument. The eyes were simply true. Her attorney said, close to her ear, "We need to go, right now. Anything you say in this room becomes part of the evidentiary record." She heard him, she processed it correctly, she understood that he was right. She was looking at Theodore Aldrich, who was passing the DNA document to the board member beside him, and whose face had taken on the specific set of a man who has been an institutional fiduciary, and is now reckoning with the implications of what he has been proximate to. She was looking at Gerald Fitch, who was not looking at her at all, who was engaged in a conversation with someone across the room with the focused attention of a man who has decided that the most useful thing he can do in this moment is not to be associated with the person he was, until 40 minutes ago, most publicly associated with. She was looking at the journalists, the editors she had positioned so carefully, who were both looking at their phones and then at Nathan and then at Clara and then back at their phones. She was looking at Nathan, who had turned away from her and was speaking to Ray Ockhaffer with the controlled efficiency of a man whose immediate environment has been secured and who is now attending to logistics. She was looking at Clara. Clara was not looking at her. Clara was crouched down next to Mason, who had found something on the carpet, a small button, apparently, that someone had lost, and was examining it with great interest. Clara had her hand on his back and was listening to him describe the button with the quality of attention that Cassandra, watching it, could not name and could not understand, and found, to her own bewilderment, the thing in the room that affected her most. Not the accusation, not the evidence, not the room full of powerful people recalibrating. A woman and her son looking at a button. Cassandra, her attorney's hand was on her arm. "We have to leave." She reached for Nathan's arm and stopped herself. She reached for something to say and found that the language she relied on, the managed, precise, strategically deployed language that had built everything she had, was not available. In the place where the words should have been, there was nothing. Just the specific silence of a person who has been performing for so long that, at the moment the performance ends, they cannot locate the person underneath it. She removed the ring. She did it slowly, not dramatically, the gesture of someone completing an administrative task rather than making a statement. The ring was warm from her finger. She held it for a moment and felt the weight of it, 3 carats, $38,000, a beautiful, expensive, carefully chosen piece of the architecture she had built. She set it on the nearest table. It made a small sound, a precise, minimal click against the ivory tablecloth, that somehow, in the silence of the room, was audible. She walked to the elevator. 300 people watched her go. No one said anything. No one moved to intercept her or to comfort her or to perform the social grace of pretending this was something other than what it was. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. She turned around, not to look at anyone in particular, but because she always turned to face the room when she stepped into an elevator. An old habit. The habit of someone who had spent their life making sure they were always facing forward. She looked at the room. Clara had stood up. She had Miles's hand in one of hers and had put her other hand on Mason's shoulder. She was not looking at the elevator. She was looking at Nathan, who had turned from Ray Ockhaffer and was looking back at her across the ballroom, and something was passing between them in that look, not romantic. Not yet, maybe not ever, but something real. Something that had survived 3 years and a conspiracy and a house in Indiana and did not require definition to be present. The elevator doors closed, and Cassandra Holt descended from the 40th floor of a building that had never been hers, in a dress she had charged to a card in someone else's name, toward a future she had not prepared a contingency for. Because she had prepared contingencies for almost everything. She had not prepared a contingency for losing. The boardroom of Blackwell Global. Saturday, 9 a.m. The city outside was doing its ordinary Saturday business, traffic, pedestrians, a delivery truck idling on the street below. The sky was a clean, pale October blue, normal, indifferent to the things that had happened in this building the night before. Nathan sat at the head of the table in the same suit he'd worn the previous evening. He had not slept. His eyes showed it, though his posture did not. To his left, Dennis Park, who had slept for approximately 3 hours in his car in the parking structure and had arrived with coffee and the comprehensive efficiency of someone who considers the display of exhaustion professionally inappropriate. To his right, Theodore Aldrich, who had called Nathan at 6 a.m. with a sentence that had been uncharacteristically unguarded for a man of his professional formality. "Nathan, you have the board's full support. Whatever needs to be done." Aldrich was 68, white-haired, with the weathered, careful look of someone who had been making consequential decisions for a very long time and had learned to live with the weight of them. He had served on this board for 9 years. He had voted to confirm Nathan as CEO. He had 6 months ago shaken Cassandra Holt's hand at a board dinner and described her to his wife afterward as competent and perhaps a little too interested in the architecture of things. He had not pursued that instinct. He was reckoning with that now. The access deactivation was processed at midnight, Dennis said, opening his laptop. Her name is removed from all internal systems as of 6. The penthouse key cards have been deactivated. Her parking credentials are voided. The Centauro account, Nathan asked. Illinois Financial Crimes has a freeze order in process. Ray says it'll be executed by Monday. Dennis looked up. Marcus Webb finalized his cooperation agreement last night. His attorney called me at 2 a.m. to confirm. He's providing testimony on the full timeline, the surveillance operation, the evidence fabrication, the communication interception system. The communication filter on my accounts, Nathan said. Webb set it up at Cassandra's instruction 14 months ago, Dennis said. It was embedded in the calendar sync system that Cassandra established with Priya's account as the nominal host. It was designed to look like an organizational tool. A pause. It was not an organizational tool. Priya, Nathan said. Dennis looked at him over his glasses. Priya made us sent the tip, Nathan said. It was not a question. He had worked it out in the early morning hours. She was the anonymous source. Technically, we don't. Dennis set down his pen. She's going to need some form of protection, he said. Whistleblower status, formally documented, and she's going to need to know that her employment is secure. Her employment is more than secure, Nathan said. When this is fully processed, I want her involved in the design of the new internal ethics structure. Aldrich looked at Nathan. New ethics structure, he said. There's going to be a new ethics structure, Nathan said. An independent board, real authority, staffed by people who are not filtered through any individual's management chain. He looked at Aldrich. What happened in this company happened because the architecture allowed it. She didn't create the vulnerabilities. She exploited vulnerabilities that already existed. We're rebuilding. Aldrich sat with this. The board will support that, he said finally. Nathan nodded. He picked up his phone. He looked at it for a moment. Then he called Clara. She answered on the second ring, which meant she had not been asleep either. The DNA is formally certified, and the paternity recognition documents were filed this morning, he said. Mason and Miles will be legally recognized as my sons by the end of the month. A pause. He heard her breathe. He heard in the background the specific morning sounds of a small house, water running. The low voice of a children's program. Miles saying something urgent and Mason responding with the methodical patience of a brother who has decided to be the calm one. Okay, Clara said. I want to talk about what comes next, Nathan said. Not through attorneys, just us. Not today, you've had enough of today, so have I, but soon. Okay, she said again. Then how's the board? He almost smiled. She had, in the middle of everything else, thought to ask about the board. Managing, he said. Aldrich. Present, stable, useful. Good, she said. He always struck me as a person who, given accurate information, makes reasonable decisions. He does, Nathan said. A pause. Then, the thing he hadn't prepared for, hadn't known he needed to say until the moment required it. Clara, I need you to know that the apology I owe you is not something I know how to do adequately. I'm aware of that. I'm not going to try to do it in pieces or... Nathan. Yeah. Let's start with what's best for them, she said. The rest can come after. He sat in the boardroom of his company, at the head of a table surrounded by the men who ran his empire, and he felt something shift in him. Not a dramatic thing, not a collapse or a revelation. Something quieter. The specific shift of a person who has been carrying something at the wrong angle for a long time and has just found the right one. I'll be in Millbrook Monday, he said. They'll be here, she said. He ended the call. Aldrich was watching him. She's going to be important, Aldrich said, not a question. She already is, Nathan said and picked up his pen. The reckoning, when it arrived in its full legal form, was not swift. This was the thing that stories rarely accounted for: the slowness of justice, its unglamorous, procedural, document-heavy reality. There was no single moment of final sentencing, no clean cut. There was a process, and the process took time, and inside the time, things moved and shifted and settled in ways that were less cinematic than necessary. Cassandra Holt was formally charged 6 weeks after the engagement party. The charges were substantial: financial fraud, conspiracy to commit evidence tampering, obstruction related to parental rights, and a civil suit filed by Nathan's legal team alleging fraudulent inducement, wrongful termination by proxy, and damages related to the concealment of paternity. Stephen Hale filed a separate family law claim on behalf of Mason and Miles Reyes that would take 13 months to fully resolve and would result in a landmark family court ruling on the concealment of paternity as a form of harm to a minor. Cassandra's assets were frozen pending the criminal investigation. The $38,000 ring sat in a Blackwell Tower evidence bag in Ray Acker's case files. The Delaware shell company Centaura Consulting LLC was formally dissolved by court order. Her apartment, the one she had furnished as a staging ground for the life she intended to build, was subject to a lien. She had, as promised, contingencies. Her defense team was excellent and expensive, paid for through accounts that had been established before the freeze order and were therefore accessible. They built a case around managed ambiguity. The email was, they argued, a reference to an entirely different operational matter. The payments to Marcus Webb were, they argued, compensation for legitimate consulting services. The security footage manipulation could not, they argued, be conclusively proven to have been directed by their client specifically. They were very good lawyers. Marcus Webb was a better witness. He testified in the preliminary hearings with the methodical, detail-oriented thoroughness of a man who had built his entire career on documentation, and who, having decided to cooperate, brought that same thoroughness to the process of destroying his former client. He had records. He had communications. He had, most devastatingly, a series of voicemail recordings from Cassandra, made over the years with the automatic backup system on a phone he hadn't told her about. That included 3 conversations in which she discussed the Clara Reyes operation in terms that left no construction available to her defense. The most significant of these recordings was played in the preliminary hearing. In it, Cassandra's voice was captured saying, "I need to know that she can't reach him. Not now, not in 6 months, not ever. Whatever that requires." The courtroom had been quiet when the recording ended. Cassandra had sat at the defense table with her hands folded and her face arranged in composure, and everyone in the room, every journalist, every legal observer, every person who had watched this case develop, had registered the quality of that composure and understood that it was the last performance, the final deployment of the only tool she had left. Gerald Fitch resigned from the Blackwell Global Board within the week following the engagement party. He issued a statement through his attorney that was, Ray Acker noted privately, a masterclass in saying nothing specifically culpable in a large number of words. He was not charged. He had been careful enough in his arrangements with Cassandra to maintain a deniability that was probably genuine. He had been an instrument, not a co-conspirator, and instruments rarely have the standing for criminal charges. He was, however, finished in the circles that had defined his professional life. The old money network was not forgiving of embarrassment. He had introduced a fraud into a boardroom, and the boardroom would not forget it, and the retirement that followed was quieter and less comfortable than the one he had planned. Marcus Webb received a sentence of 4 years and served 2, with conditions. He was never again employed in any capacity that required trust. Priya Mehta was formally recognized as a whistleblower under Illinois state law, which provided her with employment protections and a legal record of her contribution to the case. Nathan appointed her to the design committee of the new ethics board, where she demonstrated the same quality of observation she had always possessed, now directed toward systems design rather than concealment management. She became, within 18 months, the most important person on that committee. At Blackwell Global, the reconstruction that Nathan undertook in the aftermath was slower and more structural than anything he had done in his 4 years of company rehabilitation. He engaged an independent auditor who had no previous Blackwell connection. He built an ethics board with genuine authority, not advisory, but operational, with the power to halt processes and require reviews. He identified the communication vulnerabilities that Cassandra had exploited and redesigned the information architecture of his personal and professional accounts from the foundation up. He also did something that surprised his board. He held a company-wide meeting and told the truth. Not the legal version, not the carefully managed narrative that a PR team would have constructed. He stood in front of the company's combined staff, all 412 of them, assembled in the large conference center on the 38th floor, and he said that someone had operated inside this company for months and had done harm, and that the harm had been possible because the culture of this company had allowed it. He said that the culture was going to change. He said he was going to be the first thing that changed. It was not a speech. It was not polished. It was a statement delivered in the same quiet, terminal register he used in boardrooms, and it was the most effective communication he had produced in 4 years of running the company because it was the only one he hadn't managed. 412 people listened. Several of them afterward went to their desks and did something they had not done in a long time. They trusted the room they were in. Clara did not leave Millbrook immediately. This was not inertia, it was principle. She had obligations to the insurance office in Indianapolis, whose remote work she had been doing reliably for 2 years, to the 2 local businesses whose books she kept, to Linda Oakes, who had given her weekday mornings back for 22 months and deserved notice rather than a sudden disappearance, and to Mrs. Dorothy Hofstede, who had given a strange woman from Chicago a house on Sycamore Road without references and had been placing soup on the porch ever since. Clara served her professional notice to each of these obligations with the same care she had brought to everything. 2 weeks for the insurance office, a month for the bookkeeping clients, enough time for them to find replacements she personally vetted, a genuine and unhurried goodbye dinner with Linda Oakes, at which Miles ate 3 pieces of garlic bread, and Mason described in detail to Linda his current theory about latch mechanisms, while Clara and Linda talked and did not cry, and then cried briefly on the porch afterward. Mrs. Hofstede was last. Clara brought her coffee and sat with her on the porch on the 2nd Saturday of November, while the boys played in the dead leaves in the yard with the focused commitment of people engaged in important work. "I heard about what happened," Mrs. Hofstede said. Dorothy Hofstede was 79 and had lived in Millbrook for 60 of those years and had strong opinions about nearly everything and very good sources for all of them. "Earl Cutler's nephew works in Chicago. It's been in the news." Clara looked at her coffee. "I imagine it has," she said. "Those boys are going to be in a very different kind of life," Mrs. Hofstede said. "Yes," Clara said. "Are you ready for that?" Clara considered this. Outside, Miles had buried himself in leaves up to his waist and was asking Mason to add more. Mason was adding more with systematic thoroughness. "I've been ready to give them what they deserve for 2 years and 4 months, Clara said. "The rest I'll figure out as I go." Mrs. Hofstede was quiet for a moment. "You know," she said, "when you came to my door 3 years ago you were carrying something heavy. I could see it. I didn't ask what it was because it wasn't my business, but I could see it." "I know you could," Clara said. "It's lighter now," Mrs. Hofstede said. "You're still carrying something, but it's lighter." Clara looked at the yard where her sons were buried in November leaves, laughing at a volume that was unreasonable and perfect. "Yes," she said, "it is." Nathan had, with Clara's explicit input at every stage, arranged the apartment in Chicago, a 3-bedroom in Lincoln Park, 2 floors below his own, not inside his space, adjacent to it. The distance was not managed distance. It was not the distance of people keeping each other at arm's length. It was the distance of 2 people being careful with something that mattered too much for carelessness. He had proposed nothing beyond the practical. He had made no claims on her beyond the legal reality of their shared children and the professional arrangement they were constructing. He came to Millbrook on Mondays and on alternate Thursdays. He fixed things. He sat on the porch steps and read to whichever boy climbed into his lap, and they both did eventually, Mason after a longer evaluation period that seemed to Nathan, who recognized the pattern, almost genetic. He did not perform fatherhood. He simply showed up, consistently, with the specific reliability that he had brought to the only other long-term commitment of his life, which was Blackwell Global, and which he now understood was perhaps not the most important thing he had ever committed to. The house on Sycamore Road was cleaned and emptied on a Friday in late November. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment before she closed the door, looking at the empty room, the marks on the wall where the drawings had been, the paler rectangles where the books had blocked the sun on the painted shelves. She had been happy here, in the way that you can be happy inside a difficulty, not in spite of it, but inside it, genuinely, because the thing that matters most to you is present and the rest is just weather. She closed the door. Nathan had offered to drive them to Chicago himself. She had said, "Send a car," not because she didn't want him there, but because she had driven herself to Millbrook 3 years ago, and she needed to leave it the same way she'd arrived, on her own terms, under her own power. She put the boys in the car. Miles, from his booster seat, looked out the window at Sycamore Road receding behind them and said, "Goodbye, house." Mason looked out at it too. He didn't say anything. He reached over and patted his brother's arm with the single, economical gesture of a person who understands that some things don't require expansion. Clara drove north. She did not look in the rearview mirror. She had done that before, leaving a life. She had learned that the things worth keeping come with you. The things you leave behind are already where they belong. The boys fell asleep before they reached the interstate, in the absolute and committed way of small children in moving vehicles. Clara drove in the quiet, and the city came slowly into view, its skyline rising ahead of her, those towers lit against the winter sky, enormous and lit against the dark. She had been invisible in that city once. She was not invisible anymore. April arrived with the specific insistence of Chicago Springs, which do not ease into being but appear fully formed and emphatic, as though the city has been holding its breath through 5 months of winter and has finally decided to be done with it. The park near Lincoln Park proper was full on Saturday morning. Families, dogs, a food truck doing aggressive business in breakfast sandwiches, an elderly couple on a bench sharing a newspaper in the manner of people who have been sharing newspapers for 40 years and have worked out the logistics entirely. Nathan took the boys to the park for the first time. He had been to the park before, but always as the person Clara described it to him afterward, the park trip, what Miles said, what Mason found. He had listened to these accounts with the focused attention he had given to everything Clara told him about his sons, filing each detail in the same way he filed operational intelligence, not for analysis exactly, but for understanding, for knowing who he was dealing with. Today he was the one taking them. Clara was having coffee with Rosa, who had come to Chicago for the weekend. Nathan had suggested this with a care that Clara had registered, the offer of time that was specifically about giving her something separate, something that was hers, because Nathan was slowly, painstakingly, learning the difference between being present and being crowded. He walked with Miles on his left and Mason on his right, and each of them held one of his hands with the specific grip of small people who have decided that this particular structure is satisfactory. Miles's hand was slightly looser, the grip of someone who is comfortable. Mason's was slightly tighter, not with anxiety, but with the focused quality of someone who has decided that if they are going to hold a hand, they are going to hold it properly. The park opened up around them. A dog barked at a squirrel with magnificent futility. Mason released Nathan's hand and crouched immediately to examine something on the path, a beetle, it turned out, navigating a crack in the pavement with the methodical determination of something that has somewhere to be. Mason did not touch it. He observed it. He made a sound that indicated provisional respect. Miles stood beside Nathan and watched his brother, and then looked up at the trees, and then at the skyline visible above the tree line, and then at Nathan. "Dad," Miles said. It was the second time. The first time had been on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon 2 weeks ago, directed at a question about whether orange juice came before or after breakfast, a logistical inquiry, firmly practical. This time it arrived differently, deliberate, a word that Miles had been trying on and had decided fit. Nathan looked down. "Yeah, buddy. Is our house going to stay fixed now?" Miles asked. The question was specific and practical in the way that Miles's questions always were, the question of a person who has learned, somewhere in the first 2 years of their existence, that the quality of things is worth confirming. Nathan crouched down to eye level. The park continued around them. Mason had moved on from the beetle and was examining the root structure of a nearby tree with his characteristic total focus. A family walked past. Somewhere behind them, the food truck beeped a cheerful announcement about something. "Yes," Nathan said, "everything is going to stay fixed." Miles considered this. He applied to it the same evaluation he applied to everything, unhurried, thorough, arriving at conclusions with a patience that was already, at 2.5, becoming recognizable as a permanent feature of his character. He nodded. Then he ran to join his brother at the tree. Nathan stayed crouched for a moment. He didn't have a reason to stay crouched except that standing back up felt like returning to something, and he wasn't quite ready. He watched his sons at the tree. Mason was pointing at a specific root formation and explaining something to Miles with the serious authority of someone who has done his research. Miles was listening in the way he listened to Mason, not fully convinced, but genuinely open, which was the most generous form of listening. Nathan thought about the house on Sycamore Road that he had never been to before 3 months ago, the curtains sewn from remnants, the bookshelf made from milk crates, the drawings on every wall dated in pencil on the back, the furnace that wheezed, the 2 pairs of muddy sneakers on the porch steps, side by side. He thought about a woman who had worked 3 jobs and slept 5 hours a night, and kept a folder of evidence under her bed in a waterproof case for 2 years, patient as stone, because she had understood that the truth required protection before it could become useful. He thought about what it had cost her. He thought about what it had cost his sons. He stood up. In the weeks since Chicago, he had done the work that he could do, the legal work, the financial work, the structural work of making a life adjacent to theirs that was reliable enough to depend on. He had not rushed the other work, the work of understanding what he had failed at and what it meant and what different looked like from here. That work was slower. It required, he was discovering, a different kind of patience than the kind he had applied to mergers and rehabilitations, not the patience of someone managing an outcome, but the patience of someone committed to a process without a predetermined endpoint. Clara had, over the months since October, given him something he had not asked for and had not earned but had received anyway, access. Not forgiveness, which was different and slower and would come or not on its own terms. Access to the boys, to the information about who they were, to the small, ordinary details of the life she had built, what Miles ate for breakfast, what book Mason was currently obsessed with, what sound the furnace used to make, and how the new one was quieter in a way that had taken her 2 weeks to adjust to. She gave him this deliberately, not generously. Generosity implies ease, and this was not easy. Deliberately, with the conscious choice of someone who has decided that her children's father deserves access to his children's life and has committed to providing it regardless of what it costs her in exposure. He was trying every day to deserve it. He walked to where the boys were at the tree. "What are we looking at?" he asked. "Root architecture," Mason said without looking up. "This root went under the path. You can see where it came back up on the other side." "It went around the obstacle," Nathan said. "Under," Mason corrected. Going around would have been less efficient. Nathan looked at his son. "You're right," he said. "Under is more efficient." Mason looked up at him then, a brief, assessing look, checking whether the agreement was genuine or placating. He apparently concluded that it was genuine, because he nodded once and returned to the route. Miles, who had been listening, said, "I like that it went all the way under. It's like it decided and then it just did it." "It did," Nathan said. "Without stopping," Miles said. "Yes," Nathan said, "without stopping." The three of them stood at the tree in the April park, and the city went on around them in its ordinary Saturday abundance. And somewhere across the park, Clara Reyes was drinking coffee with her sister, and describing, perhaps, the precise and specific quality of watching two small boys with storm-gray eyes discover the world their father should have been there for from the beginning. He had not been there from the beginning. He was here now. He was going to stay. The following Monday, Clara Reyes walked into Blackwell Tower through the main entrance for the first time as Director of Ethics and Legal Compliance. Not through the service corridor, not invisible, not carrying a cleaning cart or a household management binder. She walked through the glass front doors in a suit she had bought herself, deep navy, well cut, the suit of someone who knows the difference between what they are owed and what they have earned, and has decided to dress for both simultaneously. The receptionist, a young man named James who had worked the desk for 18 months, looked up when she approached. "Good morning," he said. "Can I help you?" "I'm Clara Reyes," she said. "I start today." James looked at his screen. His expression shifted, not dramatically, but distinctly, from professional courtesy to something that contained recognition. The name in this building, over the past 3 months, had acquired the particular resonance of names that become more than names. "Ms. Reyes," he said, "welcome back." She looked at him for a moment. Not with triumph, not with the particular satisfaction of a return that has cost something enormous and arrived nonetheless. Those emotions were present, somewhere beneath the surface, in the complex layering of a person who has been through what she has been through and come out the other side not unmarked but upright. What showed on her face was simpler than any of that. Readiness. "Thank you, James," she said. She walked to the elevator. She pressed 47. She had annotated a legal brief in this building's hallway at 11 o'clock at night with a pen from a cleaning cart, and told the man who found her that there was a clause on page 14 that would expose him to liability in 3 states. She had been right about that. She had been right about most things. The elevator rose. The 47th floor was quiet at 8 a.m., the specific productive quiet of a high-functioning team in the first hour of the workday, before the calls and the meetings and the decisions and the accumulated momentum of a running empire. She walked down the corridor, past offices she had once cleaned, past the document room she had once organized, past the corner where she had once stood with a legal brief, and changed the direction of 2 lives without knowing it. Her office was at the end of the hall. The nameplate was already on the door. Clara Reyes, Director, Ethics and Legal Compliance. She stood at the door for a moment. Then she opened it and walked in. On the desk, which was clean and organized and waited for her, was a glass of water. No note, no explanation. Just water placed there before she arrived, because someone had paid attention. She sat down. She picked up her pen. She got to work. The truth doesn't expire. It only waits. And when it finally arrives, when it walks through the door in a navy dress and sits down at a desk with its name on it, it does not perform itself. It simply begins. End of Part 1. Part 2 is coming. Cassandra Holt, from behind her attorney's desk, with her frozen accounts and her trial date and the specific fury of someone who has run out of moves, but has not run out of will, is already building the next thing. She has identified the one person Nathan cannot fully protect. The one person whose position is still, in specific and technical ways, vulnerable. The one person who walked into Blackwell Tower on a Monday morning and sat down at a desk with her name on it. Clara Reyes. Subscribe. Drop your location in the comments. We have viewers from Lagos to London, Atlanta to Auckland, and every one of you deserves to see what happens next. Because part 2 is where we find out what Cassandra Holt does when she has nothing left to lose. And that specific, cornered, incandescent fury of a person with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous thing in this story.